Tonight, we're stepping into the strange world of disappearances. Across history, there are stories of people who ruled nations, wrote books, flew planes, and then were never seen again. No warning, no reason, just gone, as if history itself erased them. Every case leaves behind fragments that hints at a story that never finished. Some are tales of obsession and adventure, others of tragedy and secrets buried deep. In this journey, we'll explore 25 of the most baffling vanishings in human history. Stories that stretch from royal palaces to empty highways, from roaring oceans to quiet suburban streets. Some were searching for fame. Some were running from something. Others may have found something none of us were meant to see. As we begin tonight's journey through the 25 most mysterious disappearances in history, tell me, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it for you? Drop it in the comments below. And if you enjoy the strange and unexplained, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Now settle in, turn down the lights, and let your mind drift through the strange, quiet spaces where people simply vanished. These are the top 25 mysterious disappearances in history. On the morning of July 2nd, 1937, the world's most famous woman pilot climbed into her silver Lockheed Electra and disappeared into the clouds and into legend. Amelia Earhart had already crossed the Atlantic alone. She had broken speed and distance records. She was the face of courage, elegance, and flight itself. But now she wanted to do something no one had done before. Circle the globe along the equator, the longest route possible. By the time she reached the island of New Guinea, she had already flown 22,000 miles. Just 7,000 remained, the final stretch across the endless Pacific Ocean. It was supposed to be the home run. Instead, it became her grave. That morning, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, took off from Lae, Papua New Guinea, with 400 gallons of fuel and clear weather ahead. Their target, Howland Island, a tiny speck of land barely visible even from the sky. The US Coast Guard waited nearby, ready to guide her in by radio. For hours, she sent messages back. Her voice was calm, professional, confident. Then, as they neared Howland, everything began to fall apart. Clouds moved in, visibility dropped, she couldn't see the island, and her compass readings grew uncertain. The radio transmissions weakened. The Coast Guard could hear her, but she couldn't hear them. Her voice came over the airwaves one last time, steady but strained. "We must be on you, but cannot see you. Gas is running low. We are on the line 157337, and then silence. There was no mayday call, no crash signal, just the sound of static, swallowed by the Pacific. Within hours, the largest air and sea search in history began. 66 planes, 9 ships, 250,000 square miles of ocean, combed for weeks. They found nothing, not a single scrap of metal, not a trace of fuel, not even an oil slick. It was as if the sky itself had erased her. Amelia Earhart's disappearance became one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. Everyone had a theory. Some said she ran out of fuel and plunged into the ocean. Others believed she veered off course and crash-landed on a nearby atoll. Years later, on a deserted island called Nikumaroro, explorers found strange clues. A fragment of aluminum, a woman's shoe, the remnants of a compact mirror. In 1940, a partial skeleton was discovered. At the time, it was labeled as male. Decades later, forensic testing suggested otherwise. The bones likely belonged to a tall woman, about Amelia's height. Could she have survived the crash? Lived as a castaway on a deserted island, calling for help no one could hear? Between July 2nd and July 6th, faint radio signals were detected by amateur operators across the Pacific. One of them claimed to hear a voice. "This is Amelia Earhart, on an island, We can't hold on much longer. The US Navy dismissed them as hoaxes. But modern analysis shows some of those transmissions came from the right frequency, at the right time, bouncing off the atmosphere exactly as her radio would have. If that's true, she was alive for days. Other theories are darker. Some believe she drifted hundreds of miles off course and crash-landed in the Marshall Islands. Territory then under Japanese control. Locals later told stories of a white woman pilot taken prisoner. The US government denied it. Others claimed it was covered up to avoid tension before World War II. Then there are the deep-sea explorers searching for her Electra beneath miles of ocean floor. They've found debris, sonar shadows, even tantalizing metal fragments. None confirmed. None certain. For nearly 90 years the mystery has remained, not just because it's unsolved, but because it embodies something deeper. Amelia Earhart wasn't simply a pilot who vanished. She was a symbol of the edge, of human ambition stretched to its breaking point. She once said, "Adventure is worthwhile in itself." And maybe, for her, that was the truth. Maybe the story of Amelia Earhart isn't about where she fell, but about how far she dared to go. Somewhere over the Pacific, between sky and sea, a voice faded into static. And in that silence, an icon was born. Next disappearance, even more chilling. A man who jumped out of a plane and was never seen again. It was Thanksgiving Eve, November 24th, 1971. The rain was coming down in sheets over Portland, Oregon. Inside the Northwest Orient Airlines terminal, a man in a dark suit and black tie walked up to the counter, cigarette in hand, and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle, cash only. The name he gave was simple, Dan Cooper. He was polite, calm, even friendly. Nothing about him seemed unusual. He boarded the Boeing 727 carrying only a briefcase and a newspaper. Flight 305 was a short 30-minute hop, Portland to Seattle. 37 passengers, 6 crew, routine. But halfway through the flight, Cooper handed a folded note to one of the flight attendants. She smiled politely, assuming it was a phone number. He leaned toward her and said quietly, "Miss, you'd better read that note. I have a bomb." The note was handwritten in neat block letters. It said he had explosives in his briefcase and wanted $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck ready in Seattle. The attendant sat frozen. Cooper calmly opened the briefcase. Inside were red sticks, wires, and a battery pack. "Tell the captain," he said, "and no one gets hurt." For the next 3 hours, the flight became a slow, surreal negotiation at 30,000 feet. Cooper smoked a cigarette, ordered bourbon and soda, and chatted politely with the crew. He was never angry, never nervous. He even paid for his drink. When the plane landed in Seattle, the ransom was waiting. 10,000 $20 bills, all with recorded serial numbers. 4 parachutes were delivered, 2 main, 2 reserve. He released all 36 passengers, keeping only the flight crew on board. Then he gave new instructions. The plane was to take off again, southbound toward Mexico City, flying low at 10,000 feet, landing gear down, cabin unpressurized, and cruising at minimum speed. He told the pilots to leave the rear staircase unlocked. At 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 lifted off once more into a storm over the Cascade Mountains. Cooper stood in the rear of the plane, briefcase in hand, and looked back at the dark sky. At 8:13 p.m., a warning light flashed in the cockpit. The rear stairway had been lowered. A sudden change in air pressure hit the cabin. The pilots radioed back to air traffic control. Then, nothing. When the plane landed in Reno hours later, the rear stairs were still down. Cooper and the money were gone. The FBI immediately launched one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. They searched hundreds of square miles across Oregon and Washington, combing forests, rivers, and mountain ridges. They found no parachute, no briefcase, no body. Not a single shred of evidence that the man ever existed. And just like that, D.B. Cooper, and the name reporters mistakenly printed the next day, became a legend. Who was he? Witnesses described a man in his mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, with dark hair, brown eyes, and a calm, almost military bearing. He was well-spoken, intelligent, and strangely confident. The FBI thought he might be a veteran, possibly a pilot, or someone with skydiving experience. The ransom money, $200,000, would have been worth nearly $1.4 million today, but the cash was worthless if he didn't survive the jump. And that's the central question. Did he? The conditions that night were brutal. Heavy rain, freezing wind, total darkness. The plane was flying at over 200 miles an hour. Cooper jumped somewhere between Seattle and Reno, likely over dense forest near the Lewis River in Washington state. Experts said it would have been suicide. No night vision, no helmet, no visible landing zone. Yet, there was no body. Months passed, then years. The FBI chased hundreds of leads. Every man named Cooper on the West Coast was questioned. Military paratroopers, airline employees, ex-convicts, none matched. In 1980, 9 years after the hijacking, a boy camping with his family along the Columbia River found something buried in the sand, a bundle of decaying $20 bills, still bound with elastic bands. They totaled $5,800. All the serial numbers matched the D.B. Cooper ransom money. The discovery reignited the mystery. Had the river washed the cash downstream from his landing site, or had someone buried it there later as a decoy? The rest of the money, nearly $194,000, was never found. Over the decades, hundreds of theories emerged. Some said he was a skydiving expert who survived and disappeared under a new identity. Others believed he died instantly when his parachute failed to open. One theory named a man called Dwayne Weber, a quiet ex-convict who, on his deathbed in 1995, told his wife, "I'm D.B. Cooper." After his death, she found a hidden diary with strange entries referencing the hijacking. But DNA tests from cigarette butts left on the plane didn't match him. Another suspect was Richard Floyd McCoy, a Vietnam veteran who, months later, hijacked another plane using the same method. Parachute, ransom, low-altitude escape. He was caught and killed in a shootout. Many believed McCoy and Cooper were one and the same, but physical evidence ruled that out too. Others pointed to Kenneth Christensen, a quiet Northwest Airlines flight attendant with paratrooper training. He fit the age, the height, even the calm demeanor. But after his death, nothing was found, no money, no confession, no link. In total, the FBI investigated over 800 suspects. None were ever charged. By 2016, after 45 years, the Bureau officially closed the case. They admitted there was no conclusive evidence, no fingerprint match, no confirmed DNA, no recovered parachute. Just a mystery sealed by time and wilderness, but some clues still nag at investigators. The parachutes Cooper chose, he took 2 and left 2 behind, were real and functional. That meant he knew what he was doing. He also asked for 4, possibly to make police think he'd take a hostage. That's tactical thinking. He refused to take military-grade chutes, preferring older, civilian one. That's experience. Someone who understood their differences and his timing. Perfect. He jumped at a point when the plane's radar signature merged with heavy weather, almost impossible to track. He had to know that too. Everything about D.B. Cooper suggested a man who'd planned this for months, maybe years. He knew the Boeing 727 had an aft staircase, one of the only planes you could exit mid-air. He knew the altitude limits for a survivable jump. He knew where the radar would fail. He was no amateur. So who was he? A rogue pilot, a former paratrooper seeking revenge on the Airlines, a man tired of ordinary life who simply vanished into the storm and became a ghost. In 2017, an amateur research team analyzing flight data pinpointed a potential landing zone in the dense forests of southern Washington, near the Tina Bar site where the money was found. Ground searches uncovered fragments of parachute material, but tests were inconclusive. Still, some experts believe Cooper may have survived that jump. If he did, he would have been in his mid-40s in 1971. That means, if alive, he'd be over 90 today. Somewhere out there, watching as his legend refuses to die. D.B. Cooper became more than a man. He became an American folk tale. A story of rebellion, freedom, and the ultimate getaway. A man who defied gravity, the government, and time itself, and walked straight into immortality. In the years since, his name has inspired songs, books, movies, even whiskey brands. But the truth, who he really was, where he landed, and what became of him, remains locked behind the roar of that storm and the sound of the wind tearing through an open hatch at 10,000 feet. The man who fell from the sky left nothing behind but a question that still haunts everyone who's ever stared out of an airplane window at the endless dark and wondered, what if someone just jumped and never came back? The world loves a good mystery. And if D.B. Cooper was the man who vanished into the sky, then Jimmy Hoffa was the man who disappeared into the ground, or so many believe. By 1975, Jimmy Hoffa was one of the most famous and feared men in America. He wasn't a movie star or a politician or a gangster, though he had friends in all three worlds. He was the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, a labor union with over 2 million members and billions in assets. He'd built his power from nothing. The son of a coal miner, he'd started organizing workers in his teens, rallying truck drivers who were underpaid, overworked, and often beaten for trying to protest. By the 1950s, Hoffa was unstoppable. He had money, influence, and the loyalty of the working class. But he also had the attention of another group, the Mafia. The mob controlled much of the union's pension fund, using it to finance Las Vegas casinos and real estate deals. Hoffa's relationship with them was mutually beneficial, until it wasn't. In 1967, Hoffa was convicted of bribery, fraud, and jury tampering. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison, but even behind bars, he remained a force. He ran the Teamsters through intermediaries, still pulling strings from his cell. Then in 1971, President Richard Nixon commuted his sentence. On one condition, Hoffa could never again engage in union leadership. For Jimmy Hoffa, that was like a death sentence. He didn't want retirement, he wanted his power back. And that desire, that defiance, might be what got him killed. On July 30th, 1975, Hoffa woke up at his lakefront home in Michigan. He put on a short-sleeved shirt, dark slacks, and his favorite gold watch. Around 2 p.m., he drove his maroon Pontiac Grandville to the Machus Red Fox restaurant, a quiet place in the Detroit suburbs. He was there to meet two men, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a Detroit mob enforcer, and Anthony Tony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters official with known mafia ties. They were supposed to discuss union business, specifically Hoffa's plan to reclaim leadership. But when he arrived at the restaurant's parking lot, neither Tony showed up. Witnesses saw Hoffa pacing near his car, frustrated, checking his watch, occasionally glancing toward the road. At 2:45 p.m., he called his wife from a payphone. "They're late," he said. "I'll be home by 4. That was the last confirmed contact anyone ever had with him. When 4 o'clock came, Hoffa didn't return. By evening, his family grew anxious. His car was still in the parking lot. doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. But Hoffa was gone. No witnesses saw a struggle. No one heard a shout. It was as if he'd stepped out of reality and vanished between one heartbeat and the next. The FBI launched an immediate investigation, codenamed Case 47. Within hours, agents suspected foul play. Hoffa had enemies everywhere, rival union bosses, mobsters, even former allies. Dozens of tips poured in, most of them worthless. Some claimed he'd been abducted, others that he'd fled the country, hiding from the mafia's wrath. But as the hours turned to days, one fact became clear. Jimmy Hoffa wasn't missing, he was dead. The question was where. FBI agents scoured the area around the restaurant. They drained nearby lakes, searched fields, broke open septic tanks. They found nothing. Then came the flood of rumors, each more sensational than the last. Some claimed Hoffa's body had been stuffed into a 55-gallon oil drum and buried beneath Giant Stadium in New Jersey. Others swore he'd been cremated in a mob-run Detroit funeral home, his ashes scattered before police even knew he was gone. Another story said he was buried under a driveway or ground up and mixed into the steel of a car. Every theory seemed to fit, and none could be proven. The investigation spanned decades. Dozens of mob figures were questioned, but no one ever talked. Those who might have known the truth died, some quietly, some violently. The last confirmed sighting of Hoffa came from a truck driver who said he saw him getting into a maroon Mercury Marquis, driven by a man he didn't recognize. That lead went nowhere. Forensic teams later discovered a single hair strand in the back seat of that same car, and DNA tests in 2001 matched it to Hoffa. But it wasn't enough to prove what happened next. FBI wiretaps and informants later suggested that the order had come from the top, from the mob's national leadership, who feared Hoffa's return to power would draw unwanted federal heat. They couldn't afford a man like him, unpredictable, stubborn, and loud, at the center of their operations again. According to one FBI informant, Hoffa was lured into the car under the pretense of a meeting, driven to a private home, and executed within minutes. His body was allegedly cremated in a nearby facility under false paperwork. It's a story that fits. Clean, quiet, final. But without a body, it remains an echo. For nearly 50 years, Hoffa's disappearance has been one of the FBI's greatest unsolved cases. Hundreds of digs, countless confessions, and even deathbed revelations have led nowhere. In 2012, the FBI searched a field in northern Detroit after a tip from a man who claimed his father buried Hoffa under concrete. Nothing. In 2021, they returned to New Jersey. Scanning land near an old landfill after a worker claimed to have seen a body loaded into a steel drum there in the 1970s. Again, nothing. Every few years, a new rumor surfaces. Every time, it ends in silence. Jimmy Hoffa's story is more than a crime mystery. It's a study in power, how it's built, how it corrupts, and how it consumes. He had risen from the working class to control one of the most powerful unions in the world. He made deals with the mob, then tried to break away from them. And in the end, he learned the same lesson as every man who thinks he can bargain with darkness, that you can't shake hands with the devil and walk away clean. His wife, Josephine, died in 1980 without ever knowing what happened to him. His children continued to fight to clear his name, or at least to find his body. But half a century later, Hoffa remains where he always was, somewhere between fact and legend. A man who could bring the country to a standstill with a phone call, reduced to a rumor. In 1982, 7 years after he vanished, a Michigan court officially declared him dead. But for millions, Jimmy Hoffa never really disappeared. he became an idea of loyalty gone wrong, ambition gone too far, and the price of crossing the wrong people in a world where every handshake hides a knife. And maybe that's why his story still matters. Because everyone knows what happens to men like Jimmy Hoffa. They don't fade quietly. They're erased violently. He walked into a Detroit parking lot on a summer afternoon, and the world never saw him again. And just like that, one of America's loudest voices went silent. But the next disappearance is darker still. 5 children who vanished not from the world, but from their own home. A Christmas Eve fire that should have left ashes, but left only questions. It was 24th December 1945 in Fayetteville, West Virginia, a quiet town tucked in the Appalachian Hills. The Sodder family home stood 2 stories tall, a simple wooden house glowing with warmth and laughter that night. George and Jenny Sodder had 9 children. 5 of them were still awake, too excited to sleep, waiting for Santa, for presents, for another ordinary Christmas morning. By midnight, George and Jenny went upstairs to bed. The children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, stayed downstairs a little longer, playing with their new toys. At around 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. Jenny answered. A woman's voice, someone she didn't know, asked for a name she didn't recognize. There was laughter and glasses clinking in the background. Jenny told her she had the wrong number, hung up, and went back to bed. Moments later, she noticed the lights were still on and the curtains open. She assumed the kids had fallen asleep and would turn everything off soon. She drifted back to sleep. Just before 1 a.m. she woke again, this time to the sound of something hitting the roof. A rolling, heavy thud. Then silence. A few minutes later, the smell of smoke filled the air. When Jenny ran downstairs, flames were climbing up the walls near the phone. George shouted for the children, ordering everyone out. The 2 oldest boys, John and George Jr., escaped. So did the parents and their daughter, Marion. But 5 children, the youngest ones, were trapped upstairs. George tried to reach them. The stairs were already on fire. He ran outside to grab his ladder, which always leaned against the side of the house. It was gone. He sprinted to his truck, planning to drive it close enough to climb onto the roof. But neither of his 2 work trucks would start. He tried to fetch water, but the hose was frozen solid. The fire burned faster than anyone could react. Within minutes, the entire home was engulfed. By dawn, it had collapsed into a heap of ash and twisted metal. Neighbors and firefighters arrived too late. The blaze had destroyed everything. But when they sifted through the ruins, something was missing. 5 children, no bones, no remains, nothing. Authorities called it a tragedy. They believed faulty wiring had sparked the fire, but George and Jenny didn't believe that. Not for a second. The Christmas lights had still been glowing as the fire started, meaning the power was intact. And if the children had perished in the flames, there should have been bones, even fragments. A local crematorium operator confirmed it. A 2-hour fire at 2,000 degrees, he said, wouldn't destroy bones completely. The Sodder house had burned for barely 45 minutes, yet there was no trace, not even teeth. The official ruling, accidental fire, did nothing to calm the family's doubts. If their children had died, where were they? And if they hadn't, who had taken them? In the months before the fire, strange things had been happening. George Sodder, an Italian immigrant, was outspoken in his criticism of Mussolini and the fascist government in Italy. It was a dangerous opinion to hold in a tight-knit immigrant community. A few weeks before the fire, a traveling salesman had visited the Sodder home. He offered to sell them life insurance. When George declined, the man grew angry. "Your house will go up in smoke," he warned, "and your children are going to be destroyed." George thought it was just bluster, until that night. Another man had been seen parked on the highway near the Sodder home, watching the children as they came home from school. No one ever learned who he was, and the missing ladder George couldn't find during the fire? Days later, it was discovered thrown down an embankment near the property. 5 children, ages 5 to 14, vanished that night. And soon the clues started to multiply. A telephone repairman told investigators the home's phone lines had been cut, not burned. A bus driver passing through Fayetteville around the same time reported seeing people tossing balls of fire toward the house, possibly Molotov cocktails. Months later, when snow melted, Jenny found a strange object in the yard, a dark rubber casing. It looked like part of a hand grenade or incendiary device. She became convinced that was what she had heard hit the roof before the fire began. If she was right, the Sodder fire wasn't an accident. It was arson, and possibly abduction. The case quickly grew stranger. A local woman claimed to have seen the missing children in a passing car the morning after the fire. A hotel clerk in Charleston, 2 hours away, insisted she saw 4 of them with 2 Italian-looking men and a woman, all checking in late at night. And a waitress in another town said a group matching their description came in for breakfast that morning, silent, pale, and nervous. Police followed every lead. None went anywhere. Years passed. The Sodders never rebuilt their home. They turned the site into a memorial garden, placing flowers where their children's bedrooms had once stood. George spent his life chasing clues, hiring private investigators, following tips across the country. One detective took his money and disappeared entirely. In 1949, the family hired a pathologist to re-examine the ashes. He found a few small bone fragments, a piece of vertebra. But testing showed it came from someone much older than the missing children. The bones had likely been mixed in from a cemetery dump site where filled dirt had been taken. Once again, nothing. Then in 1968, something arrived in the mail. It was an envelope postmarked from Kentucky, no return address. Inside was a single photograph of a man in his 20s. On the back, a handwritten note, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Lil boys, A90132 or 35. Louis had been one of the missing children, 9 years old when the fire occurred. The man in the photo looked eerily like him, just older, dark hair, strong eyes, familiar smile. The Sodders were convinced it was their son. They hired another investigator to track down the source. He went to Kentucky and was never heard from again. The trail went cold once more. George Sodder died in 1969, never knowing what happened to his children. Jenny kept the photograph on her mantle until her own death 20 years later. The remaining Sodder siblings continued to pursue answers. But time, as always, worked against them. Witnesses died, records vanished. And whatever evidence once existed, whether buried in ash or silence, was gone forever. Theories persist. Some believe the children were kidnapped by someone connected to George's anti-fascist views, taken back to Italy, or hidden within an organized network. Others think the fire was meant as a warning, and that the children were killed elsewhere to erase any trace. No one knows for sure. Today, the Sodder case remains one of America's most haunting, unsolved family mysteries, not just for its tragedy, but for its impossible contradictions. A house burns to ash, 5 children vanish, and not a single bone or body ever turns up. At the edge of Route 16 in Fayetteville, the Sodders built a billboard, huge, white letters against black paint, with photographs of the missing children and a plea for information. It stood there for nearly 40 years, weathered by rain and sun, until it was finally taken down in the 1980s. By then, It had become a monument, not just to the missing, but to the refusal to forget. Because for George and Jenny Sodder, there was never closure. Only hope, fading, stubborn, eternal. And while that mystery began with a fire, the next began in cold stone, a royal tower, 2 princes, and a crown that demanded their silence forever. The fire that consumed the Sodder home took place in a small West Virginia town. But this next disappearance unfolded in the heart of a kingdom, inside stone walls meant to protect royalty itself. It is one of England's oldest and most haunting mysteries. 2 young princes, 1 throne, and a silence that has lasted more than 500 years. The year was 1483. King Edward IV of England was dead. He left behind 2 sons, Edward, aged 12, and Richard, aged 9. Under normal circumstances, the elder boy would inherit the throne as King Edward V. But history, especially royal history, is never normal. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed Lord Protector, a guardian meant to watch over the new king until he came of age. He swore loyalty to his nephews, vowing to protect their claim. But power has a way of rewriting vows. Only weeks after their father's death, the young Edward and his brother were escorted to the Tower of London, not as prisoners, but supposedly for safekeeping before the coronation. The Tower, despite its grim reputation, was still a royal residence at the time. Kings often stayed there before ascending the throne. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The boys were seen playing in the gardens, waving from the battlements. Servants brought them meals. Visitors reported that the princes appeared cheerful, unaware of the storm forming around them. Then something changed. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, began consolidating power. He arrested the boys' allies, claiming they were plotting against the crown. He declared Edward IV's marriage to their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, invalid, which made the 2 princes illegitimate and therefore ineligible to rule. Weeks later, Parliament agreed, and on July 6, 1483, Richard crowned himself King Richard III. After that day, the princes were never seen again. Witnesses said they noticed the boys less frequently at the windows of the tower. Then not at all. Guards were replaced, servants dismissed, and by late summer rumours began to spread through London. Whispers that the princes were dead. But how? And on whose orders? No official statement was ever made. Richard III denied involvement, though he offered no proof of their survival. Some believed they were quietly murdered to secure his throne. Others thought they were secretly smuggled out of England and hidden abroad. The truth vanished with them. For centuries, the disappearance of the princes has haunted British history, a riddle wrapped in royal blood. Chroniclers of the time offered grim accounts. One writer, Sir Thomas More, claimed the boys were smothered in their sleep by 2 of Richard's men, their small bodies buried at the stair foot, meatly deep. More's version became the basis for Shakespeare's play Richard III, forever branding the king as a villain, the hunchbacked usurper who killed his own nephews for power. But history is rarely that simple. Sir Thomas More wrote his account decades after the event based on second-hand stories, and even if Richard had motive, evidence against him was circumstantial. Modern historians have suggested other culprits: Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, a former ally who turned against Richard, or Henry Tudor, who defeated Richard 2 years later and became King Henry VII. If the princes were alive, their claim would threaten his new dynasty. Perhaps, they argue, it was Henry who silenced them after all. The Tower of London has kept its secrets well. Then, in 1674, nearly 2 centuries later, workers renovating the tower's White Tower discovered a small wooden chest buried beneath a staircase. Inside were 2 tiny skeletons. They appeared to belong to children, roughly the same ages as the princes when they vanished. The bones were reburied in Westminster Abbey, sealed in an urn inscribed with their names. But science was young then, no DNA tests, no forensic certainty. In 1933, the urn was briefly opened for examination. The bones did belong to children likely aged 10 to 12, but without modern analysis, identification was impossible. The remains were resealed, and the mystery resealed with them. What happened to the princes inside that fortress remains one of the great, unsolved disappearances in world history. Were they murdered, hidden? Did one of them escape? Some legends claim the younger prince Richard survived under an assumed identity, living out his life in secrecy. A few centuries later, a man named Perkin Warbeck claimed to be that surviving prince. He even gathered an army to reclaim the throne, only to be captured and executed. Was he a fraud, or a ghost from history come back to haunt those who buried the truth? The case has endured not because of what we know, but because of what we'll never know. The tower still stands, cold and silent, overlooking the Thames. Tour guides point to the Bloody Tower, the place where the boys were last seen. Some claim to have seen two pale figures wandering the grounds at night, hand in hand, two children forever waiting to be set free. But even without ghosts, the tragedy lingers. Two boys, heirs to the greatest kingdom in Europe, vanished without a trace. Their uncle took their crown, their bones were never proven, and their names became legend. Richard III himself didn't hold the throne for long. 2 years later, he was killed at the Battle of Bosworth, the last English king to die in combat. His body was lost for centuries, finally discovered under a parking lot in 2012. Even his bones couldn't escape irony. The man accused of hiding the princes ended up hidden himself. And yet, though his skeleton was found, the princes were not. Their story remains incomplete, half history, half shadow. Over 500 years later, the debate continues. Some call Richard a murderer, others insist he was framed. But whoever ordered their deaths, one thing is certain: the disappearance of the princes in the tower changed England forever. It ended a dynasty, sparked wars, and turned children into eternal symbols of innocence, swallowed by power. When you walk the cobbled paths of the tower today, you can almost feel their silence, the weight of history pressing down through the centuries, the echoes of footsteps that never grew up. Two boys entered the tower to be crowned. They never came out. And while those royal brothers vanished behind stone walls, the next disappearance took place far across the ocean, a colony full of men, women, and children who built their homes, carved their future, and then disappeared into the wilderness. When two royal brothers vanished in London, their story became legend. But across the sea, another disappearance would haunt an entire nation, not two children this time, but an entire colony, 117 souls who stepped off the edge of the known world and were never seen again. It began in the summer of 1587. England was still a rising power, eager to stake its claim in the New World. Queen Elizabeth I had granted a charter to Sir Walter Raleigh to establish a permanent English settlement in North America, a base for trade, exploration, and ambition. The first attempt, a few years earlier, had ended badly. The settlers on Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina had returned to England starving and desperate, but Raleigh was determined to try again. This new colony would be different. It would be led by John White, an artist, cartographer, and governor. This time, families would come, not soldiers, men, women, and children, ordinary people chasing a dream of a new life. Among them was White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, who would soon give birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. It should have been a new beginning. Instead, It became a question mark in human history. When the colonists arrived, they found the previous settlement in ruins, homes overgrown, livestock gone, the fort decaying, but they rebuilt, determined to start fresh. For a time, things went well. The land was rich and the coastal waters offered fish and trade routes. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Relations with the local Croatan and Secatan tribes were strained. Food was scarce, and soon their supplies began to dwindle. In August 1587, John White sailed back to England to secure more provisions. He promised to return within months. But fate had other plans. When he arrived home, England was preparing for war. The Spanish Armada threatened invasion. Every available ship was commandeered for defense. White pleaded for a vessel to return to his family, but no one would risk it. It would take him 3 long years to finally make it back across the Atlantic. When he did, in 1590, Roanoke was gone. White's ship reached the island on a grey August morning. Smoke rose faintly from the trees, but when they came ashore, they found only silence. The fort stood empty, half collapsed. Grass and weeds grew through the wooden posts. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle. Every house had been dismantled carefully, as if the settlers had left by choice. But they'd left behind one clue, carved into a fence post at the edge of the settlement. One word, Croatoan, and on a nearby tree the letters Crow. White's heart leapt. Before he'd departed years earlier, he'd told the colonists that if they were forced to leave, they should carve the name of their destination, and if they were in danger, add a cross beside it. There was no cross. It seemed his family and the others had gone willingly, perhaps to Croatoan Island, now known as Hatteras. But the weather turned. A violent storm struck before the crew could sail there. Their ship, low on supplies, was forced to turn back to England. John White never returned to America again. So what happened to the Roanoke colonists? It's one of the oldest unsolved disappearances in North American history, and one of its strangest. Some historians believe the colonists did what the carving suggested. They joined the Croatan people. Over time, they may have integrated into the tribe, adapting to survive. There are later reports of Native American groups with grey eyes and English-style clothing, faint traces of Roanoke's lost bloodline. Others think the truth was far darker. The Carolina coast was harsh and unforgiving. Storms, drought, and hunger could have wiped out the settlement. It's also possible that conflict with neighboring tribes ended in massacre, but no mass graves, no weapons, no remains were ever found. And then there's the more mysterious theory that Roanoke was never just one place, but part of something larger. In 1607, 20 years after Roanoke vanished, settlers established Jamestown, just a few hundred miles north. Captain John Smith, the leader of the new colony, recorded something strange in his journals. He claimed that several native chiefs told him of men dressed like Europeans living farther inland, pale-skinned people who could speak out of a book. Smith was convinced they were survivors from Roanoke, but when he sent scouts to investigate, they found nothing. Later, other explorers made similar reports, glimpses of light-haired children among indigenous villages, English words spoken by those who'd never seen an Englishman. But none of these accounts were ever proven. Over the centuries, evidence has surfaced, fragments of pottery, iron tools, and 16th-century artifacts buried along old trade routes. Each discovery seems to whisper that the lost colony didn't die all at once. Perhaps it scattered fragment by fragment into the wilderness. Maybe Roanoke didn't vanish, it simply changed. But the story doesn't end there. In 2020, archaeologists using new mapping technology identified 2 sites on the mainland near Roanoke that could hold answers. They called them Site X and Site Y. At Site X, they found pieces of English pottery from the late 1500s, the exact period of the lost colony. The discovery reignited a centuries-old theory that the colonists split into smaller groups, one heading to Croatoan Island, another moving inland to find safety among friendly tribes. If that's true, then perhaps the mystery isn't one of disappearance at all, but survival. Still, John White's fate remains heartbreaking. He never saw his daughter again, never held his granddaughter. In his final writings, he called himself the most sorrowful man alive. He died without knowing whether his colony and his family had lived or perished. The story of Roanoke has become a mirror for our imagination. Every generation reshapes it into legend, into warning, into ghost story. Some say the colonists were taken by spirits of the land. Others say disease or famine consumed them. In the 20th century, even wilder theories emerged. Secret Spanish attacks, alien abductions, time slips. But at the core of it all lies something simple and human, the terror of being forgotten. 117 men, women and children built a new life on foreign soil. And then history erased them. No one ever found their bodies, their graves, or their descendants. Only one word carved into a post, Croatoan, remains. A single word that's echoed across 4 centuries. Today, Roanoke Island is peaceful. Green fields, quiet marshes, and a reconstructed fort that welcomes tourists. But when the wind moves through the trees, locals say you can still hear faint cries from the shore, the echoes of those who vanished into the unknown. Maybe it's only the sea, or maybe it's the sound of history refusing to stay silent. Either way, the mystery endures. A colony vanished without a trace, and the first child born on American soil became a symbol of a nation's first ghost story. And while the settlers of Roanoke were swallowed by wilderness and sea, our next mystery drifts across another vast ocean. A ship found adrift and intact, its cargo untouched, its crew gone as if lifted straight into thin air. The lost colony of Roanoke vanished into forests and tide. Nearly 3 centuries later, another disappearance would unfold, this time in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. No settlers, no soldiers, just a crew of sailors, a merchant ship, and a mystery that's haunted the sea for over 150 years. The Mary Celeste set sail from New York Harbor on November 7, 1872. It was a sturdy merchant brigantine, 100 feet long, carrying barrels of industrial alcohol bound for Genoa, Italy. Captain Benjamin Briggs commanded the ship. He was 37, experienced and deeply religious. His wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, joined him on this voyage. Alongside them were 7 crewmen, all seasoned sailors with clean records. By all accounts, the Mary Celeste was in perfect condition. The weather was clear, the cargo secure. It should have been an uneventful trip across the Atlantic. Instead, it became one of the strangest disappearances in maritime history. A month later, on December 5, 1872, another ship, the Dei Gratia, spotted a vessel drifting aimlessly between the Azores and Portugal. At first, they thought it was abandoned wreckage, but as they drew closer, they saw it was intact. Sails partially set, rigging flapping in the wind, moving slowly under its own power. Through the spyglass, the captain of the Dei Gratia, David Morehouse, recognized it instantly. It was the Mary Celeste. The 2 ships had left New York only 8 days apart. Briggs and Morehouse were friends. Seeing his colleague's ship adrift in open water made no sense. Morehouse sent a boarding party. When his men climbed aboard, they found an eerie silence, the kind that makes the hair rise on the back of your neck. The deck was slick but clean. The ship's wheel turned lazily in the breeze. Below deck, everything was in perfect order. The crew's clothes were folded neatly in their chests. Cabins were tidy. The cargo, 1,700 barrels of alcohol, was mostly untouched. The ship's logbook was still in the captain's cabin, the last entry dated 10 days earlier, November 25th, when the Mary Celeste was just north of the Azores. Nothing unusual was recorded, but the lifeboat was gone. So was the ship's chronometer and most of the navigation instruments. There was no sign of violence, no struggle, no blood, no damage to the ship. Just an empty vessel perfectly seaworthy drifting alone in the vast Atlantic. The Mary Celeste had plenty of food and water. The sails were slightly torn and one of the pumps had been disassembled. But the hull was dry. There was no reason to abandon it. Yet 10 people had vanished into thin air. The Dei Gratia crew sailed the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, where British authorities launched a formal investigation. The inquiry became one of the most detailed in maritime history, and the most baffling. At first, suspicion fell on Captain Morehouse and his crew. After all, they were the ones who'd found the ship and claimed the salvage reward. Some suggested they had murdered Briggs and his crew to seize the cargo, but the theory fell apart. The condition of the ship, undamaged, with personal belongings still aboard, didn't fit a violent encounter. The British tribunal eventually cleared the Dei Gratia of wrongdoing. That left only one question. What happened to the people of the Mary Celeste? Over the years, theories have multiplied like waves in a storm. One of the earliest explanations was an explosion, or the threat of one. The ship was carrying barrels of alcohol, some of which were found leaking. If fumes had filled the hold, even a small spark could have triggered disaster. Captain Briggs, fearing an imminent explosion, might have ordered everyone into the lifeboat temporarily, planning to tether it to the ship until the danger passed. But perhaps the line snapped and the lifeboat drifted away. It's a logical theory, Pellant, but one detail complicates it. The main hatch was secure and there was no sign of scorching. Still, later experiments showed that alcohol vapor can cause a flash fire, a blast of flame that leaves no marks but would terrify anyone aboard. Maybe the captain made a split-second decision and paid the ultimate price. Other explanations veer into the bizarre. Some blamed pirates, though the cargo was intact and valuable goods like jewelry were untouched. Others suspected mutiny, but there was no sign of struggle. There were wilder ideas too, a seaquake, a waterspout, even sea monsters. In the late 19th century, newspapers loved the phrase ghost ship. The Mary Celeste became one of the first real-life stories to capture that image. A vessel drifting through fog, crew vanished as if lifted by invisible hands. Decades later, author Arthur Conan Doyle, before he created Sherlock Holmes, published a short story inspired by the mystery. It was called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement and imagined the Mary Celeste as a cursed ship doomed to sail forever. The story was fiction, but readers believed it. Newspapers had to print corrections clarifying that Doyle's tale was made up. By then, it didn't matter. The Mary Celeste had already crossed from history into legend. For a while, the ship continued to sail. After the investigation, it was returned to its owners and refitted, but its reputation was ruined. Sailors called it unlucky, the cursed ghost of the Atlantic. The Mary Celeste changed hands several times, each new owner meeting misfortune. Finally, in 1885, its last captain deliberately ran it aground off the coast of Haiti in an insurance fraud scheme. The ship broke apart on the reef, its remains swallowed by the sea it once haunted. But the story of its crew, the Briggs family, and 7 sailors still drifts through maritime lore. 10 people left New York with hope and purpose. None were ever seen again. What really happened aboard the Mary Celeste remains unknown. Perhaps a false alarm, an imagined danger, led to panic. Perhaps a freak storm separated ship and lifeboat forever. Or maybe something happened out there we still can't explain. The Atlantic keeps its secrets. In recent decades, marine archaeologists and historians have revisited the mystery. Re-examining the captain's log, they note that the ship had been battling rough weather for days before the disappearance. Water may have seeped in, triggering the bilge alarm, and convincing Briggs the ship was sinking. If the water in the hold looked higher than it was, thanks to the disassembled pump, he might have ordered an evacuation, believing the Mary Celeste was doomed. But if so, why not return when the sea calmed? Did the line between lifeboat and ship snap overnight? Did they drift under an empty sky, watching their vessel, their salvation, disappear over the horizon? We'll never know. Today, the phrase ghost ship owes much of its meaning to this story. The Mary Celeste was no myth, no phantom conjured by superstition. It was real. It sailed, and then it didn't. It carried people, and then it didn't. And the silence it left behind is louder than any storm. Sometimes mysteries don't need monsters. The ocean itself is enough. The Mary Celeste still lives in that liminal space between logic and legend, between calm seas and the unknowable deep. 10 souls lost, a ship found intact, and a question that will never stop drifting. And if the Atlantic could swallow a ship whole, our next disappearance reminds us it can swallow even more, not just one vessel, but entire fleets, aircraft, and lives, all drawn into one of the most infamous regions on Earth. The ocean had already claimed the Mary Celeste, but in the 20th century it would take something even stranger. 5 U.S. Navy bombers, a rescue plane sent to find them, and every man on board. No wreckage, no survivors, only static, confusion, and silence. This is the story of Flight 19, the disappearance that gave birth to the legend of the Bermuda Triangle, December 5, 1945. World War II had ended just months earlier. At Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station in Florida, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers were preparing for a routine training exercise. Navigation problem number 1. It was simple: fly east over the Atlantic, then north, then back to base. A standard triangular route over calm seas. The pilots were all experienced men, young but well trained. Leading them was Lieutenant Charles Taylor, a decorated veteran with over 2,500 flight hours. Nothing about the mission suggested danger. At 2:10 p.m., Flight 19 lifted off. The sky was clear. The last anyone saw of them, the Avengers were flying in perfect formation toward the open sea. For nearly 2 hours, everything went as planned. Then, at around 3:40 p.m., a crackle broke through the radio channels at Fort Lauderdale. It was Lieutenant Taylor. His voice sounded calm, but uncertain. "Both my compasses are out," he said. "I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, but everything looks wrong." Radio operators tried to triangulate his position. They asked him to switch frequencies, to turn west toward the setting sun. But Taylor seemed disoriented. "We don't know where we are," one pilot transmitted. "The ocean looks strange. Everything is wrong." Over the next 2 hours, confusion deepened. At one point, Taylor believed they were flying over the Florida Keys, hundreds of miles off course. He ordered his squadron to turn northeast, further into the Atlantic. Ground control begged him to reverse direction, but the signals were weak. Static drowned their words. By 6:20 p.m., daylight was fading. The last coherent message came through from one of the wingmen. "Everything looks strange. We can't tell which way is up. It looks like we're entering white water. We're completely lost." Moments later, radio silence. 5 aircraft, 14 men, vanished from radar. Within minutes, search and rescue teams were scrambled. The Navy launched one of the largest air and sea searches in history. Ships, aircraft, and submarines combed the ocean through the night. At 7:30 p.m., a Martin PBM Mariner flying boat carrying 13 crew members took off from Patrick Air Base to search for the missing Avengers. 20 minutes later, it vanished too. A nearby tanker reported seeing a massive explosion in the sky, a flash followed by fire on the water. The Mariner, nicknamed the Flying Gas Tank because of its volatile fuel load, was never found. In a single evening, 27 men disappeared without a trace. Days turned into weeks. More than 300 aircraft and 21 ships searched 250,000 square miles of ocean. No bodies, no debris, no oil slicks, nothing. The official Navy report called it one of the strangest mysteries in the history of aviation. When investigators interviewed base personnel, they learned something chilling. Before takeoff, Lieutenant Taylor had requested to be replaced on the mission, claiming he wasn't feeling well. He'd also left behind his personal flight watch, something no pilot ever did, but the base commander insisted he was fit to fly. The investigation concluded with a phrase that has haunted the case ever since. Cause unknown. Over time, theories multiplied. The simplest explanation was navigational error. Taylor may have mistaken the Bahamas for the Florida Keys, leading his squadron hundreds of miles off course until they ran out of fuel. But that doesn't explain why all 5 planes vanished without leaving even a floating raft or oil slick. Then came the weather argument, that an unexpected squall or downburst scattered the formation and sank the aircraft. Yet no storms were recorded in the area that day. And then came the theories that made Flight 19 famous. The Bermuda Triangle, a loosely defined region stretching from Florida to Bermuda to Puerto Rico, an area blamed for vanishing ships, planes, and even entire crews. Writers in the 1950s and 60s claimed Flight 19 had been swallowed by something beyond explanation. Magnetic anomalies, underwater pyramids, even portals to another dimension. They cited Taylor's strange final transmissions as evidence, compasses spinning wildly, the sky glowing, the sea turning white. It was irresistible to the imagination, and while the US Navy never endorsed these ideas, they didn't have much else to offer. Flight 19 remains officially missing in action. Years later, fragments of wreckage were found off the Florida coast, but none matched the serial numbers of the missing Avengers. Some divers claim to have discovered the remains of one or more planes from the mission. Each time, hope flickered, and then was extinguished by inconclusive evidence. Even the location of Taylor's last transmission remains debated. Some think he was near the Bahamas, others place him closer to the Gulf of Mexico. In either case, no wreckage field has ever been found that could account for 5 heavy bombers and a rescue plane. There's one final twist. In 1986, a retired Navy airman revealed that after the disappearance, parts of a wrecked Avenger had washed ashore on Florida's east coast, but that the military quietly removed the debris before locals could see it. If true, it suggests the planes did go down near land, and that the sea claimed them before anyone could prove it. But no documentation has ever surfaced to confirm that story. Even today, 80 years later, the loss of Flight 19 feels different. It wasn't one pilot, it wasn't one storm, it was 5 planes flying together, trained men, all vanishing in formation. To believe it was just getting lost feels unsatisfying, and yet that may be the truth. Maybe their compasses really did fail. Maybe the sun set faster than expected, the horizon disappearing into cloud and water until direction itself lost meaning. Maybe, in those final moments, the ocean and sky looked the same, and the pilots, desperate to level out, flew straight into the waves. Sometimes the simplest answers are the hardest to accept. The Bermuda Triangle has claimed hundreds of lives over the centuries, from ships like the Cyclops and Ellen Austin to modern aircraft. But Flight 19 remains its crown jewel. The story that gave it its name. Because unlike myths of ghost ships or ancient curses, this one really happened. 5 Navy bombers took off from Florida on a clear afternoon. None came home. Their final transmissions still echo across history. Fragments of panic, wonder, and resignation. We can't tell which way is west. Everything looks strange. It looks like we're entering white water. Don't come after us. And then, silence. Today, the coordinates where Flight 19 vanished are still used by pilots and sailors, marked by tradition more than science. Some call it cursed, others call it coincidence. But when you fly over that endless stretch of blue, knowing that somewhere beneath lies 5 aircraft and 27 missing souls, it's hard not to feel something. A strange pull, like the ocean remembers. And while Flight 19 disappeared into the open sky, our next story takes us back to land. To a busy New York street on a summer evening, where a man hailed a taxi and stepped inside, never to be seen again. He wasn't a pilot, a sailor, or an explorer. He wasn't chasing fame, fortune, or the horizon. He was a judge, a man of law, order, and reason. And on a warm August evening in 1930, he stepped into a taxi on a New York City street and vanished without a trace. This is the story of Judge Joseph Force Crater, the man who became America's first true urban legend, the judge who disappeared in plain sight. August 6, 1930, Manhattan, the height of summer. The streets of the city buzzed with jazz, wealth, and political ambition. Prohibition was in full swing. Wall Street was still roaring. No one knew the Great Depression was about to crush it all. Joseph Crater was 41 years old, charming, confident, ambitious. He had recently been appointed as an Associate Justice of the New York Supreme Court, a powerful position in one of the most politically charged cities in the world. He was married, respected, and connected to the city's political elite, particularly to the Tammany Hall machine that ran New York politics at the time. To the public, he was a success story. To those who knew him better, he was a man living on the edge of too many secrets. That morning, Crater left his summer home in Belgrade, Maine, telling his wife Stella that he needed to return to the city to straighten out a few things. He promised to be back in a few days. He kissed her goodbye, got into his car, and drove off. He arrived in Manhattan the next day and checked into his apartment on Fifth Avenue. Over the next 48 hours, witnesses reported seeing him withdrawing large sums of money from the bank, nearly $5,000 in cash, and removing several files from his office. He also made several phone calls, including one to a political associate. Nothing seemed outwardly suspicious, but then came the night of August 6th. At around 8 p.m., Judge Crater was seen dining at Billy Haas's Chop House on West 45th Street near Times Square. He wasn't alone. Sitting with him were 2 companions, a fellow lawyer named William Klein and a young showgirl named Sally Lou Ritz, a tall, blonde performer known on Broadway's nightclub circuit. Witnesses said the 3 laughed, drank, and talked casually. Around 9:15, Crater paid the bill, smiled, and walked outside. He waved down a taxi. He told his friends he was going to his nearby apartment. The cab pulled away into the warm Manhattan night, and that was the last confirmed sighting of him, ever. The next day, Judge Crater didn't show up for work. His court clerks assumed he was delayed. When he missed several days in a row, rumors started to spread. By late August, his wife Stella began calling his office. She received polite reassurances, then silence. Weeks passed. Only on September 3rd, nearly a full month later, did the story finally break. A friend of Crater's finally reported him missing, and the press exploded with the story. Within 24 hours, every major newspaper in America had his photo on the front page. Missing. Judge Crater vanishes without a trace. The city went into a frenzy. Police scoured his apartment. Inside, they found his robes, clothes, and papers neatly arranged, as if he'd planned to return. But one briefcase was gone. So was the cash he'd withdrawn from the bank. Detectives questioned everyone: the lawyer, the showgirl, his driver, his staff. No one claimed to know anything, and no one ever saw him again. It was as if New York City, the most crowded place on earth, had simply swallowed a man whole. Rumors flooded the city like smoke through subway grates. Some said he'd fled to Canada with a mistress and stolen money. Others whispered he'd been murdered, silenced by Tammany Hall to keep its political secrets buried. There were even darker theories: that he'd been abducted by gangsters, that he'd been blackmailing the wrong people, that his missing briefcase contained explosive evidence of corruption in New York's courts. Investigators traced his last hours, interviewed hundreds, searched hotels, apartments, and records. Nothing. Then, in 1931, a bizarre twist. A hotel maid at the Belvedere in West 48th Street claimed she'd found a locked drawer in a room previously rented by Crater. Inside, detectives discovered personal papers, stock certificates, and 2 checks totaling more than $6,000. But there was no sign of the man himself. The papers didn't reveal where he'd gone, only that he'd been organizing his finances carefully before he disappeared. To some, that looked like preparation. To others, like a farewell. But the strangest part of all was the timing. He vanished just as New York prosecutors began investigating Tammany Hall for bribery, fraud, and illegal appointments, including several judgeships. Crater's own name was rumored to be on the list. The press dubbed him the missingest man in America. His wife became a reluctant celebrity, hounded by reporters at every turn. Every few months, new leads surfaced, all dead ends. One witness swore he saw Crater boarding a ship to Cuba. Another claimed he'd been buried under a Coney Island boardwalk. Taxi drivers across Manhattan said they'd driven the missing judge that night. None of their stories matched. Eventually, the case turned into folklore. Bartenders, police officers, and cabbies traded theories like ghost stories. By the late 1930s, pulling a Judge Crater had entered American slang, meaning to vanish without explanation. In 1959, almost 30 years after his disappearance, the case took one final strange turn. A former showgirl named Vivian Gordon was found murdered in the Bronx. Her death led police to reopen several old corruption cases involving judges and gangsters from the 1930s, and in the process, Crater's name surfaced again. Some investigators speculated that he'd been eliminated to silence him before he could testify, but there was no evidence to prove it. Even stranger, every witness who might have known something died within a few years. Ritz, the showgirl from the dinner that night, disappeared from public life. Klein, the lawyer, refused to talk. And Crater's driver changed his story multiple times. By 1979, almost half a century later, New York officially declared Joseph Force Crater legally dead. But that wasn't the end. In 2005, the NYPD received a deathbed confession from an elderly woman in Queens named Stella Ferrucci Good. Her story stunned investigators. She claimed her late husband, a police officer, had helped bury Judge Crater's body under the boardwalk near Coney Island. According to her statement, Crater had been murdered by mobsters connected to Tammany Hall after demanding kickbacks, and his body dumped in a shallow grave near West 8th Street. When police searched the area decades later, they did find skeletal remains nearby, but they were too degraded to confirm identity. If the story was true, it came too late. Time had already erased whatever truth the city once held. To this day, no one knows what happened to Judge Crater. He might have been murdered. He might have fled. He He might have met with an accident and never been found, but somehow his disappearance captured something deeper. The idea that even in a city of millions, one man can vanish and the world keeps moving. For years afterward, comedians joked about him. His name was used in songs, movies, and radio shows. But beneath the humor lay something haunting, a reminder that the line between prominence and oblivion is thinner than anyone thinks. A man who once presided over the law became a mystery no law could solve. His wife, Stella, lived until 1969. She never remarried. On her deathbed, she kept a framed photo of Joseph on her nightstand, the same one the newspapers used when he vanished. When asked if she believed he was still alive, she simply said, "No, but I still don't know where he is." In the decades since, people have continued to report ghostly sightings. An older man in a dark suit and hat, seen stepping into taxis near Times Square on summer nights. Of course, it's just folklore now, but even so, every August, the city remembers him. Because Judge Crater's story isn't just about one man's disappearance, it's about the city itself, how easily it swallows what it no longer wants to see. A powerful judge, a taxi ride, and then nothing. No ransom note, no crime scene, no goodbye. Just another mystery filed under missing. And while New York's most prominent man disappeared into the night, our next story follows someone who vanished for entirely different reasons. Not a man of power, but a young woman of extraordinary talent. A prodigy who wrote her first novel at 12, and then, one winter night, walked into the dark and was never seen again. She wasn't rich or powerful. She wasn't a politician, a pilot, or a spy. She was a writer, a dreamer with a gift so rare that critics once called her a literary miracle. At 12 years old, Barbara Newhall Follett published her first novel to worldwide acclaim. At 25, she walked out of her apartment one winter evening and was never seen again. This is one of literature's quietest tragedies. A prodigy whose words survived, but whose story disappeared. Barbara was born in 1914 in Hanover, New Hampshire, into a house filled with books and language. Her father, Wilson Follett, was a respected editor and critic. Her mother, Helen, was a writer and teacher. Words were the family's native tongue, and Barbara spoke it fluently before she could even write. From the time she could hold a pencil, she filled notebooks with stories, sketches, and imaginary worlds. At 4 years old, she invented a country called Farksolia, complete with its own language, currency, and mythology. By 10, she had written a full-length adventure novel about a girl sailing away from home to live freely at sea. Her father, recognizing her extraordinary talent, helped her edit the manuscript and send it to a publisher. In 1927, at just 12 years old, Barbara's first novel, The House Without Windows, was published by Knopf. The New York Times hailed her as a child genius of rare sensitivity. Reviewers compared her imagination to that of a young Emily Dickinson. She appeared on radio interviews, literary panels, and in newspapers across America. The quiet little girl who wrote like a poet twice her age. But behind the headlines, her life was already unraveling. That same year, her father abandoned the family for another woman. The loss devastated her. Her mother later wrote that Barbara cried for weeks, calling her father the other half of her world. The sudden fracture of her family marked the beginning of her slow drift from stability and from the world itself. After the divorce, Barbara and her mother moved frequently, living off modest teaching jobs and small writing projects. Barbara kept writing, but her tone changed. Darker, more introspective. At 14, she began a new novel, Lost Island, about a girl escaping civilization in search of freedom and truth. It was never published in her lifetime, but critics who read the manuscript years later described it as hauntingly prophetic. She wrote letters that revealed her growing frustration with the world of adults. "The human race is a very strange species," she once wrote. "They destroy what they love and call it progress." Even in her teens, she seemed caught between genius and melancholy, too perceptive for her age, too idealistic for reality. By her early 20s, Barbara had moved to New York City. She worked as a secretary, sometimes for publishing companies, sometimes for friends of her mother. She lived quietly, wrote obsessively, and still dreamed of seeing her work in print again. In 1933, she married a man named Nickerson Rogers, an outdoorsman, steady and practical, the opposite of her restless nature. For a while, they were happy. They hiked together, traveled, and dreamed of living simply, away from the noise of the city. But over time, cracks appeared. Barbara wanted adventure, creativity, something boundless. Nick wanted stability. Her letters to friends during that time carry the tone of someone slipping away, emotionally, then physically. "I am not suited to this mechanical life," she wrote in 1938. "Something in me is lost and I must find it again, even if it costs me everything." On December 7, 1939, Barbara and Nick argued. It was nothing dramatic, a small domestic fight, the kind every couple has. Afterward, she told him she was going for a walk to clear her head. She left their apartment on Brattle Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, carrying just a few dollars in her pocket. She never came back. At first, Nick assumed she had gone to stay with a friend. When a day passed with no word, he called her mother, then the police. But the investigation was strangely subdued. Weeks passed before the missing persons report even made it into the newspapers. By then, any trail she might have left was gone. There were no witnesses, no sightings, no letters. It was as though the world had swallowed her, quietly, efficiently, completely. Some believed she had taken her own life. Her writings in the months before her disappearance often spoke of despair, of feeling trapped in a life too small for her imagination. Others believed she had simply run away, reinvented herself under a new name, starting fresh somewhere far from the expectations that had followed her since childhood. Her mother refused to accept either version. She believed Barbara had met with foul play, that something darker had happened, and that Nick knew more than he admitted. In 1952, but more than a decade later, Helen Follett wrote a public letter to the police, pleading for them to reopen the case. She accused Barbara's husband of withholding information, noting that he had waited 2 weeks before even reporting her missing. But by then, Nick had remarried and moved on. The investigation turned up nothing new. By the time the 1960s arrived, Barbara's name had faded from memory, except among a small circle of literary scholars who kept rediscovering her work. Each generation that stumbled across The House Without Windows felt the same uncanny pull, the sense that its young author had written her own fate long before it happened. In the novel, the heroine leaves behind her family and home to live freely in nature. She disappears into the forest unseen again by human eyes. The book ends with her spirit merging with the natural world. Not dead, but transformed, untethered. Readers have often wondered if Barbara saw herself in that story, if her walk that winter night was her final act of authorship. No body was ever found, no trace of her ever surfaced, just an echo, the faint outline of a girl who wrote too beautifully for the world she lived in. Today, scholars call Barbara Newhall Follett one of literature's ghost voices. Her surviving manuscripts, written in fountain pen and fading ink, are preserved in archives, their margins filled with small doodles, stars, and half-formed poems. She wrote about the wildness inside the heart, the need to escape cages made of comfort and routine. And perhaps in some tragic way, she did. her disappearance remains one of the most haunting unsolved cases in literary history, not because of what we know, but because of what she might have written had she lived. A child genius who vanished into adulthood, leaving only her words behind. Even now, her name appears occasionally in literary journals or podcasts, a cautionary whisper about the fragile line between brilliance and heartbreak. She was the promise of a future that never arrived, the author of her own mystery. No one saw her leave. No one saw her arrive anywhere else. All that remains is the echo of her first line, written at age 12. Somewhere the world is quiet and full of light. And from one vanished writer to another, our next story takes us to Fifth Avenue in 1910, to a woman of wealth and status who stepped out for an afternoon of shopping and never returned. Fifth Avenue, New York City, December 12, 1910. The air was crisp, the streets alive with the hum of carriages and chatter. Among the well-dressed crowds that afternoon walked a young woman named Dorothy Arnold, 25 years old, educated, wealthy, and seemingly without a care in the world. She left her family's mansion on East 79th Street just before noon, dressed elegantly in a tailored blue coat, a fur muff, and a matching hat. She told her mother she was going out to buy a dress for an upcoming party. It was a simple errand. She never came home. That ordinary walk became one of the most enduring mysteries in American history, a disappearance that exposed the hidden anxieties of high society and a family's desperate effort to conceal its shame. Dorothy Harriet. Camille Arnold was born into privilege. Her father, Francis Arnold, was a wealthy perfume importer, a man of status and influence in New York's social circles. Her family was part of what newspapers called the 400, the exclusive upper tier of Manhattan's elite. Dorothy graduated from Bryn Mawr College, fluent in French, witty, independent, and strikingly modern for her time. She dreamed of becoming a writer, something unusual for a woman of her social class. Her parents disapproved, insisting she marry well instead of pursuing a career. But Dorothy was determined to make her own way. She began writing short stories and submitting them to literary magazines under her own name. None of them were accepted. One rejection letter in particular, from McClure's magazine, hit her hard. She later told friends it made her feel like a failure at everything. That single sentence would haunt the investigation for years to come. On that winter morning in 1910, Dorothy left her home at around 11 a.m. She told the maid she'd be back for dinner. She walked to the Park and Tilford candy shop on Fifth Avenue, where she bought a box of chocolates. From there, she stopped at Brentano's bookstore at 27th Street and purchased a copy of Engaged Girl Sketches, a light, romantic novel. A friend saw her there, Frances Farnham, a former classmate. They chatted briefly. Dorothy seemed cheerful, untroubled. She mentioned she was planning to walk home through Central Park. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. By evening, her family began to worry. When Dorothy didn't return for dinner, her mother called several of her friends. None had seen her. Her father dismissed it at first, assuming she was staying overnight with someone she knew. But when the next day came and went with no word, the Arnolds began to panic. Still, they didn't call the police. For reasons that remain debated, Francis Arnold, proud, controlling, and deeply concerned about appearances, decided to keep his daughter's disappearance private. He believed it would cause public humiliation for the family if newspapers discovered that his daughter had gone missing. Instead, he quietly hired a private investigator from the Pinkerton Agency to look for her. The search began in silence. The investigators checked hotels, hospitals, and boarding houses across the city. They examined ferry logs and train manifests. They even sent inquiries to friends in Philadelphia and Boston. Nothing. Not a single clue. Weeks passed, then months. Finally, in February 1911, nearly 2 months after Dorothy vanished, the story broke in the New York Times. The headline read, "Society Girl Missing for 2 Months, Family Kept It Secret." It was front-page news across the country. The public was captivated. A beautiful heiress had disappeared in the middle of Manhattan in broad daylight. No ransom, no witnesses, no trace. Theories multiplied. Some believed she had eloped with a secret lover. Others whispered about suicide, scandal, or a kidnapping covered up by her family. Francis Arnold, angry and embarrassed, called a press conference at the family mansion. He stood before reporters and declared, "My daughter did not elope. If she had, she would have written to us. I am convinced she has been kidnapped or murdered." But he also made an unusual statement. "I do not believe she is in New York. If she were, she would have been found." That comment puzzled journalists, as if he knew something he wasn't saying. The investigation deepened. Police scoured Central Park, dragging the lake for bodies. They questioned cab drivers, hotel staff, and even known criminals. At one point, a rumor spread that Dorothy's body had been found in the Hudson River, but it turned out to be false. Then came another lead. A clerk at a small hotel in Philadelphia claimed that a young woman matching Dorothy's description had checked in with a man a few days after she vanished. The woman appeared nervous, he said. They registered under false names. The next morning, the man left alone. The woman was found later, dead from poisoning. But when police checked local morgue records, nothing matched Dorothy's dental or physical description. Another dead end. In the years that followed, dozens of supposed sightings came in from across the country. She was seen in San Francisco, in Chicago, in Italy. Each report was investigated. None confirmed. In 1914, a bizarre letter arrived at the Arnold home. It was postmarked from Los Angeles and written in a shaky hand. It read simply, "Guys, Mother. I am safe. Don't worry. Dorothy." Experts examined it and concluded it was a forgery. Still, it rekindled public fascination. Eventually, attention turned to one man, George Griscom Jr., a wealthy engineer from Pittsburgh and one of Dorothy's former lovers. The two had met in college, and her parents had strongly disapproved of the relationship. When investigators questioned him, Griscom admitted that Dorothy had visited him in Philadelphia shortly before she disappeared, without her family's knowledge. He said she'd seemed sad and frustrated about her failed writing career, but not suicidal. Police found no evidence linking him to her disappearance, but her father never stopped blaming him. Years later, reporters discovered that Dorothy had spent a night with Griscom at the Chatham Hotel under an assumed name, a scandalous revelation for that era. It added fuel to rumors that she might have become pregnant and either taken her own life or been forced into hiding. Despite endless speculation, one detail made the case especially haunting. Dorothy vanished in broad daylight in one of the busiest cities in the world, walking a familiar route, and no one saw what happened. No screams, no struggle, no witnesses, just absence. By 1916, the Arnold family quietly moved out of their mansion. Her mother died the following year, still hoping for word. Her father lived until 1922, bitter, angry, and defiant to the end. He once told a reporter, "I believe my daughter is dead, murdered the day she disappeared. I think she lies buried somewhere in this city, and I hope she is at peace." He was never able to prove it. Modern researchers have tried to re-examine the case through forensic and social lenses. Some suggest she may have slipped on ice crossing the park, fallen into a reservoir, and been buried under winter snow. Others suspect she was lured into a car, possibly a kidnapping attempt gone wrong. But with no evidence, it remains speculation. A few historians point to Dorothy's personality, intelligent, idealistic, quietly rebellious, and wonder if she staged her own disappearance, escaping the suffocating expectations of her class. But if she did, she never resurfaced anywhere in the world under her own name. No record of her ever appeared again. More than a century later, her story still lingers, an open case in an era long past, a missing heiress who walked down Fifth Avenue and simply vanished. Some believe her ghost still drifts there in winter, a young woman in a blue coat, stepping lightly through the snow, a book tucked under her arm, fading into the crowd. Others believe she found freedom, not death, that she slipped the gilded cage of privilege and became someone new, somewhere far away. The truth remains buried beneath the noise of time. And while Dorothy Arnold vanished in a world of wealth and propriety, our next story takes us south, across the border, into the chaos of revolution, where another writer, older and sharper, vanished into the gunfire and dust of history itself. He was called Bitter Bierce, a man whose words could cut sharper than any blade, a journalist, soldier, and satirist who made a career out of mocking the living and questioning the dead. He wrote about ghosts, murder, and war, always with the same cold precision. And one day, he became a story himself. In 1913, Ambrose Bierce, one of America's most famous writers, disappeared into the Mexican desert and was never seen again. No grave, no body, no goodbye. Just a final letter that read, "As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." Ambrose Gwinnett Bierce was born in 1842 in a log cabin in Ohio, the 10th of 13 children. His family was poor but educated, and from a young age, Bierce buried himself in books. At 15, he ran away from home to work as a printer's apprentice, and a few years later, the Civil War erupted. He enlisted immediately, joining the Union Army as a topographical engineer, a soldier who mapped the battlefield. But the horrors he witnessed changed him forever. At Shiloh, Chickamauga, and Kennesaw Mountain, he saw thousands of men die for inches of ground. He was nearly killed by a bullet to the head. And something in him, his faith, his patience, his sense of humanity, seemed to die there too. When the war ended, Bierce emerged not as a hero, but as a cynic. He moved west, first to San Francisco, then to London, then back again, building a reputation as one of America's most savage satirists. His short stories, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, The Damned Thing, The Death of Halpin Fraser, blurred the line between the real and the supernatural. They were strange, unsettling, often brutal. And so was he. Friends described him as cold, brilliant, and lonely. He called himself the grinning skull of American letters. When his famous book, The Devil's Dictionary, was published, it defined happiness as an agreeable sensation arising from contemplating the misery of others. Even success didn't soften him. By the time he reached 70, Bierce was a legend and a ghost in his own lifetime. In 1913, at the age of 71, Bierce decided to do something few could understand. He left his home in Washington, D.C., sold most of his belongings, and began traveling through the American South, visiting old Civil War battlefields where he had once fought. He sent letters to friends describing the journey in his usual dry wit. "I am on a little journey to hell," he wrote in one. He visited Shiloh, Chickamauga, and Missionary Ridge, places where he'd watched history bleed. But he wasn't sightseeing. It felt more like a farewell tour. By October, he had crossed into Texas, bound for Mexico, a country then torn apart by revolution. In 1910, Mexico's people had risen against dictatorship. By 1913, the revolution was at its bloodiest. General Pancho Villa, a former outlaw-turned-rebel commander, was leading his army north against government forces, and that's where Bierce said he was headed. to observe the war and perhaps get killed in it. Friends begged him not to go. He ignored them. His last confirmed letter was dated December 26, 1913, addressed to his close friend Blanche Partington in California. In it he wrote, "Goodbye. If you hear of my being stood up against a Mexican wall and shot, please know that I think it's a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs." No one ever heard from him again. What happened next is one of the most debated literary mysteries in history. The simplest theory says he joined Villa's army and was executed by government forces sometime in early 1914, but there are no official records of any American prisoner named Bierce. Another theory claims he traveled with Villa's troops as far as Chihuahua, Mexico, and was shot during a skirmish near Sierra Mojada, a dusty mining town near the northern desert. Local folklore supports this. In the 1920s, a priest from the area claimed an old American was executed there by a firing squad for spying. He even pointed out a shallow grave, long since lost to time. But when historians visited the site, they found nothing. Others believe he died of illness or exposure while crossing the desert. His letters hinted at poor health, fatigue, dizziness, failing vision. Some think he simply collapsed somewhere between Chihuahua and the US border, his body swallowed by the wasteland. There are darker theories too. One suggests that Pancho Villa's men grew suspicious of the aging foreigner with notebooks and sketches, assuming he was an American spy. If true, he might have been executed without ever revealing his name. Another theory, more poetic than factual, imagines that Bierce, ever fascinated by death, orchestrated his own disappearance, that he chose to vanish into legend, becoming the very ghost he had written about his entire life. What makes his story so haunting is how well it fits his own writing. In one of his short stories, The Difficulty of Crossing a Field, a man steps into a grassy meadow in full view of neighbors and simply disappears. No sound, no trace. Just gone. That was Bierce's ending too, a man of reason and realism, swallowed by the unknowable. For decades after, people claimed to have seen him in Mexico, in Texas, even in South America. One American soldier insisted he met an old man calling himself Bierce in the 1920s, living quietly in the mountains. A journalist once published what he said was Bierce's death certificate, but it turned out to be fake. Each clue led nowhere. Each sighting added another layer of myth. In the centuries since, historians and biographers have searched for evidence, but none has ever been found. His writings ended where his footsteps did, abruptly, mid-thought. Perhaps that's why his disappearance still feels like part of his work. A final, unfinished story written in the desert dust. In the end, Bierce became what he spent his life studying, a ghost, a man who mocked death until it finally answered. He once wrote, "To be a ghost is to have survived everything." And maybe, in a way, he did. Today, his name lives on in whispers, in the quiet corners of libraries and the yellowed pages of war stories. His words remain sharp, cruel, and eerily prophetic. But his final chapter belongs to silence. Somewhere in the north of Mexico there's an unmarked grave, or perhaps nothing at all. Only the echo of a gunshot that may never have happened, and a name that refused to die. Ambrose Bierce, the man who defined death only to vanish into it. And while Bierce's disappearance was wrapped in war and legend, our next mystery belongs to a very different time, the late 1980s, when a young woman on a quiet bike ride in New Mexico vanished into a mystery that would shock the world. Because sometimes a photograph is the only clue left behind. It was a clear September morning in New Mexico. Blue skies, dry air, the kind of day that feels perfectly ordinary. At 9:30 a.m., a 19-year-old college student named Tara Calico rolled her pink Huffy bicycle out of the driveway of her family's home in Belen. She waved goodbye to her mother, Patty, and said she'd be back by noon. She never came home. That quiet bike ride became one of America's most enduring modern mysteries, a case that began with a simple disappearance and spiraled into one of the most haunting photographic puzzles of all time. Tara was bright, ambitious, and fiercely independent. She was studying psychology at the University of New Mexico, juggling classes, a part-time job, and an active social life. Every morning she followed the same 34-mile bike route along Highway 47, a long, empty stretch of desert road bordered by scrub and distant mountains. Her mother often joined her, but after a near miss with a reckless driver weeks earlier, Patty had stopped going. She told Tara to carry pepper spray and be careful. Tara laughed. "If something happens to me," she said jokingly, "you'll find me in the desert somewhere." It was a joke that would come to haunt her family for decades. When she didn't return that day, her mother drove the entire route, searching for any sign of her. All she found was one of Tara's cassette tape cases, lying by the roadside. By evening, panic had set in. Police launched a search and volunteers combed the area. They found pieces of her broken Walkman scattered along the highway, as if she'd dropped them while struggling. But there were no tire tracks, no footprints, no witnesses. Tara Calico had vanished into thin air. For months the investigation went nowhere. Rumors spread around town that a truck had been seen following her that morning, that two men were spotted driving erratically near the route, that someone knew more than they were saying. But there was no proof, only whispers. Years passed, and then, out of nowhere, came a photograph. On June 15, 1989, nearly a year after Tara's disappearance, a woman walking through the parking lot of a convenience store in Port St. Joe, Florida, noticed a Polaroid lying on the asphalt. It was face down, still fresh enough that the film hadn't fully faded. When she picked it up, she froze. The photo showed a young woman and a boy lying in the back of a van, both bound with duct tape over their mouths. Their eyes were wide with terror. The background was dark, the setting unclear. The woman immediately brought the photo to police. Within hours, it was being analyzed by the FBI. The girl in the photo looked eerily like Tara Calico. Same age, same hair color, same small scar on the leg. Her family agreed instantly. Even the book next to her, My Sweet Adrena by V.C. Andrews, was one of Tara's favorite novels. But there was another figure in the image, a young boy around 9 years old. He was later believed to resemble Michael Henley, another New Mexico child who had vanished months before Tara. The photo set off a nationwide frenzy. Newspapers ran headlines about a possible serial kidnapping. The FBI traced the brand of Polaroid film to a limited batch sold between May and September 1989, meaning it was taken after Tara disappeared. For her mother, that meant one thing: Tara was alive. Investigators flooded Port St. Joe. Witnesses came forward saying they'd seen a white Toyota cargo van parked near that same convenience store days earlier. Inside, they remembered, were two men, one with a mustache, one clean-shaven. Both were never identified. The photograph was circulated worldwide. Experts from Scotland Yard and the FBI analyzed it independently. Both concluded that the girl was likely Tara Calico, but neither could say for certain. Then two more mysterious photographs surfaced. The first appeared in 1990, a blurry image of a young woman's face, bound with tape, lying next to a blue-striped fabric. The second was found years later, showing what seemed to be the same woman in a different position, her eyes closed. Neither could be authenticated, but both resembled Tara. To this day, no one knows who took those pictures or what became of the people in them. In 1990, hope turned to heartbreak again. Searchers found human remains in the Zuni Mountains, about 70 miles from where Tara had vanished. At first, they were thought to be hers, but dental records confirmed they belonged to Michael Henley, the missing boy from the Polaroid. He had died of exposure while hiking with his father months before Tara disappeared. He had never been abducted. That meant the boy in the Polaroid, if real, wasn't Michael, and whoever the girl was, her identity was once again a mystery. Over the years, multiple theories emerged. Some believed Tara had been kidnapped by strangers, possibly drifters passing through rural New Mexico. Others suspected local men from her small town, people who knew her route, knew her schedule, and might have followed her that morning. A few even suggested that her death had been covered up to protect powerful families. In 2008, a sheriff's investigator named Rene Rivera claimed that he knew who was responsible. 2 local boys who accidentally hit Tara with their truck, panicked, and killed her to hide the evidence. He said the case was closed in all but name. But without a body, he couldn't prove it. The suspects, he claimed, were protected by their families and by silence. For Tara's mother, that silence was unbearable. Patty Calico spent the rest of her life searching for answers. She appeared on talk shows, pleaded with detectives, even hired private investigators. Every new lead reignited her hope. Every false one broke it again. She kept Tara's room exactly as it was. The bed neatly made, the books untouched, the pink, huffy bicycle gone. In 2003, 15 years after the disappearance, Patty died without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. When police entered her home, they found her nightstand covered in letters, unanswered, unopened, addressed to every investigator who had ever handled the case. Her final note read, "Somewhere, someone knows. I only want to bring her home." In the years since, Tara Calico's case has become a symbol, not just of one girl's disappearance, but of the countless families left in limbo between hope and grief. The Polaroid remains one of the most disturbing artifacts in American true crime history, a frozen moment of terror that refuses to give up its secrets. FBI analysts still can't confirm whether the girl is Tara. Digital forensics, AI face mapping, and new scanning methods have all yielded conflicting results. Some experts say it's her, others say it's not. But her family's certainty never wavered. They believe she's the girl in the photograph, that somewhere, in those final moments, Tara was still alive, still fighting. Even now, decades later, her story lingers in America's collective memory, a cautionary tale, a ghost story, a wound that never healed. And every few years, someone claims to have found a new clue, a van, a photo, a confession. And then, silence again. It's as if Tara's story, like the Polaroid itself, is trapped, frozen between time and truth. Tara Calico's disappearance reminds us of how fragile ordinary moments can be. A morning bike ride, a quick wave, goodbye. The simple rituals that vanish into tragedy before anyone realizes they're gone. 1 second the sun is bright, the next the world forgets to explain itself. And from one vanished face to another, our next story takes us back a decade earlier, to New York City, 1979. A young boy walking to school alone for the first time became the face of a nation's worst fear. It was a warm spring morning in New York City, May 25, 1979. Lower Manhattan was just waking up, traffic humming, store gates rattling open, sunlight catching on apartment windows. In a quiet Soho neighborhood, a 6-year-old boy named Etan Patz put on his favorite blue jeans, a striped shirt, and a small black cap. He grabbed his school bag, waved goodbye to his mum, and walked out the front door. It was the first time he had ever walked to the school bus stop alone. He never made it there. Etan vanished somewhere between his apartment on Prince Street and the corner of West Broadway, a distance of just 2 blocks. The story of Etan Patz changed America. Before him, missing children were local tragedies. After him, they became a national crisis. He was the child who put a face on fear, and a mystery that would haunt his parents, his city, and his country for more than 30 years. Etan was the youngest of 3 children. His parents, Stanley and Julie Patz, were a creative couple. Stanley, a professional photographer, Julie, a schoolteacher. They lived in a modest loft apartment in Soho, back when it was still a neighborhood of artists, factories, and cobblestone streets. Etan was curious, shy but confident, with a wide smile and bright blue eyes. He loved drawing, baseball, and, like most 6-year-olds, wanted to do things on his own. That morning, his mother hesitated when he asked to walk to the bus stop alone. But it was only 2 blocks and she could see the corner from their fire escape. She agreed, just this once. He never came back. When Etan didn't return home from school that afternoon, panic set in quickly. His mother called the school. They said he'd never arrived. Police were notified within hours, and the search began immediately. Officers canvassed every building, every alley, every basement within a 10-block radius. They searched rooftops, parks, subway tunnels, and construction sites. Dogs were brought in, helicopters circled overhead, but there was nothing, no witnesses, no sounds, just absence. Stanley Patz did what he knew best. He took his son's photograph, the one he'd captured just weeks before, and printed thousands of copies. He plastered Etan's face across the city, on streetlights, in subways, in corner stores. The image, that small, smiling boy, became iconic. For the first time, a single missing child's photograph spread across America. His face appeared on milk cartons, on television, in every newspaper. It was the first time the country collectively realized a child could vanish without a trace, even in plain sight. The investigation led nowhere. In the weeks that followed, dozens of tips poured in, false leads, crank calls, supposed sightings from as far as Florida. None were real. Months turned into years. The Patz family never moved, never changed their phone number, and never stopped searching. They kept Etan's room exactly as it was. Toys on the shelf, clothes in the drawer, frozen in time. Every birthday, every anniversary, his mother baked him a cake. Every Christmas, they hung his stocking by the window. For the rest of their lives, the Patzes lived between hope and heartbreak, waiting for a call that never came. The first major suspect appeared in 1983, a man named Jose Ramos, a convicted pedophile who had once dated a woman who babysat for the Patz family. When questioned, Ramos admitted he had been in the neighborhood the day Etan disappeared. He also described taking a young boy who looked just like Etan to his apartment. But when police searched his home, there was no physical evidence, no clothing, no photographs, no remains. Ramos denied killing Etan, but implied he might have hurt him. It was enough to keep suspicion alive for decades. In 2004, Ramos was found liable for Etan's death in a civil court case brought by the Patz family. But still there was no body, no confession, no closure. Then, more than 30 years after the disappearance, something unexpected happened. In 2012, police received a new tip about a man named Pedro Hernandez who had worked at a small grocery store near the bus stop in 1979. He had allegedly confessed years earlier to family members that he had killed a boy. The same year, Etan vanished. When investigators questioned him, Hernandez broke down. He said he had lured Etan into the basement of the store with the promise of a soda, strangled him, and put his body in a box, leaving it with the trash. It was a shocking confession, one that seemed to end decades of mystery, but it wasn't that simple. There was no physical evidence, no witnesses, and Hernandez had a long history of mental illness, schizophrenia, and delusions. Some believed he had confessed to something he only imagined. His lawyers argued that police had coerced the confession after hours of questioning. Even the details he gave were inconsistent. Wrong time, wrong place, wrong method. Still, the case went to trial. The first jury deadlocked. The second convicted him. In 2017, 38 years after Etan vanished, Pedro Hernandez was sentenced to life in prison. But not everyone was convinced. Even today, many believe José Ramos was the real culprit, or that the truth lies somewhere between the two. Neither theory can fully explain what happened to Etan Patz that morning, because even with a conviction, one question remains unanswered. Where is he? For the Patz family, closure never truly came. They accepted the verdict, but said it brought little comfort. Their son was still gone, his body never found. Time hadn't healed anything. It had only made the silence louder. Etan's disappearance changed the world in quiet but permanent ways. May 25th, the day he vanished, was declared National Missing Children's Day in the United States. His case led to the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and new laws for how police handle missing child reports. It also marked the beginning of the milk carton era, when missing children's faces appeared at breakfast tables across America. Because of Etan, millions of parents learned a name they'd never forget and a fear that would never quite leave them. In 2019, 40 years after that morning walk to the bus stop, the city of New York renamed the corner of Prince Street Etan Patz Way. His father, Stanley, attended the ceremony quietly. He still lives in the same apartment, surrounded by old photographs and memories that never faded. He once said, "You don't move on, you just keep living in the same place, waiting for the door to open again." And so he waits. Etan's story is not just about loss. It's about the line between safety and trust, and how quickly the world can take both away. It's about a single child who unknowingly became a symbol for millions. Because some disappearances don't just change a family, indeed they change history. And while Etan's mystery began in the heart of New York City, our next story drifts far from land, into a prison surrounded by water with nowhere to escape. It was the night of June 11, 1962. The fog hung low over San Francisco Bay, and the waves crashed against the rocky island that had once been called The Rock. Alcatraz, America's most secure prison, a place where they sent the men who could not be broken. Bank robbers, killers, mobsters, even Al Capone had once walked its echoing corridors. The guards used to say, "You can check in, but you'll never check out." That night, 3 men decided to prove them wrong. Frank Morris, the quiet mastermind, was the kind of man who studied blueprints for fun, brilliant, patient, and hardened by a lifetime of incarceration. He'd already escaped from several prisons before, smaller ones, but this time he was aiming for the impossible. With him were 2 brothers from Florida, John and Clarence Anglin. Strong swimmers, raised on the water, used to the cold. They'd met Morris inside Alcatraz's grey concrete walls, and together they began planning the most daring escape in American history. Alcatraz wasn't just a prison. It was a fortress. The cells were lined with steel, the walls reinforced concrete, the ocean beyond, freezing, filled with strong currents and crawling with sharks. Most inmates never even tried to escape. Those who did were either shot or drowned. But Morris and the Anglins weren't ordinary prisoners. They spent months preparing, not with weapons, but with ingenuity. Each night, using makeshift tools, a spoon, a drill bit from the prison workshop, and a homemade motor made from a vacuum cleaner, they chipped away at the crumbling concrete around the ventilation grates in their cells. They worked silently, masking the noise with music during practice hours and stuffing the dust into their pockets to scatter in the yard during the day. Behind those holes, they built a secret passage, narrow tunnels leading into an unused utility corridor that ran behind the cell block. It became their workshop, their hideout, and their ticket to freedom. Over months, they built everything they would need to cross the bay. From more than 50 stolen raincoats, they stitched together a makeshift raft and life vests. They used contact cement smuggled from the prison workshop to seal the seams, testing the waterproofing during showers. They even crafted paddles from scrap wood and nails. But the most chilling detail was how they fooled the guards. Every night, after the final head count, the 3 men placed dummy heads on their pillows, sculpted from soap, toilet paper, and hair taken from the prison barbershop. Under dim light, they looked disturbingly real, complete with painted faces and tufts of hair. When the guards walked by, everything looked normal. The men appeared to be asleep, but the cells were empty. Just before midnight on June 11, 1962, the 3 crawled through their escape holes, climbed up a network of pipes, and emerged onto the roof. From there they crossed the utility corridor, climbed a ventilation shaft, and slid down the backside of the cell house. They carried their homemade raft down to the shoreline, where they inflated it using a stolen concertina, a small squeeze-box instrument. At approximately 11:30 p.m., they pushed off from the northern shore of Alcatraz Island, paddling silently into the freezing black water toward San Francisco Bay. They were never seen again. The next morning, when guards made their rounds, they were met with 3 perfect faces once all sound asleep. It wasn't until one guard tried to wake Morris that the head rolled off the pillow and hit the floor. Alarms sounded, spotlights swept across the island, boats searched the bay, helicopters circled for hours. The official story said all 3 men drowned that night, swept away by the strong tides and cold waters. The Coast Guard searched for days, but found only fragments, a torn raincoat, a makeshift paddle, and a piece of the raft washed up near Angel Island. The bodies were never found. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in history. Over the next 17 years, every possible lead was chased down, sightings, rumors, letters. None were ever confirmed. The case was officially closed in 1979, with the Bureau concluding that the men most likely drowned before reaching shore. But most likely isn't the same as certainly. And that's where the legend begins. Over the years, countless people have claimed to have seen the Anglin brothers, alive, living under new names, hiding in plain sight. In 2013, the FBI received a letter, allegedly written by John Anglin himself. It said, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old now and in bad shape. I need help." He offered to surrender in exchange for medical care, but the letter was unsigned and forensic tests on the handwriting were inconclusive. The Anglin family insists the brothers survived. They point to photographs supposedly taken in Brazil in the late 1970s, showing 2 elderly men with striking similarities to John and Clarence. Facial recognition experts who analyzed the photos decades later said the match was likely, but again, not conclusive. Others have their own theories. Some believe the men reached Angel Island, changed clothes, and slipped into the mainland unnoticed, helped by accomplices waiting on shore. Others think the raft capsized and their bodies were swept out to sea. One retired Alcatraz guard once said, "If anyone could have made it, it was those 3. Even the ocean itself keeps its secrets. The currents of the San Francisco Bay are unpredictable, deadly in June, but not impossible to survive. Modern tests by hydrologists using replica rafts suggest that under the right conditions the escape could have worked. If they had paddled north with the tide, they might have reached the shore near Marin County, and if they had, no one would have ever known. Today, Alcatraz is a museum, a tourist site. Visitors still walk past those very cells, the chipped holes still visible behind the fake walls. They see the makeshift dummies, the painted faces staring back from the bunks, and wonder what happened that night. There's a quiet electricity in that cell block, as if the air remembers. The escape isn't just part of history, it's part of the island. Some say that on foggy nights, when the wind hits the bay just right, you can still hear the faint slap of paddles on water. 3 shadows gliding toward the Golden Gate. Free at last. Whether they drowned that night or lived out their days in secret, the truth lies somewhere beneath the surface of the bay, cold, dark, and silent. The official story says they didn't make it, but every unsolved mystery leaves a whisper behind, and this one refuses to fade. Frank Morris, John and Clarence Anglin, 3 names carved into the legend of Alcatraz, and into the impossible idea that maybe, just maybe, they made it out alive. But while these men vanished into the open water, our next mystery begins somewhere even stranger, indoors. A crowded college bar, a night of laughter, and a man who walked in, but never walked out. No boats, no tides, no ocean. Just cameras, witnesses, and a vanishing that made no sense at all. It was the first night of spring break, April 1st, 2006, Columbus, Ohio. The streets were alive with the buzz of college kids, bars spilling laughter, and neon light onto the sidewalks. For Brian Shaffer, a 27-year-old medical student at Ohio State University, it was supposed to be a break from exhaustion, a night to unwind, to feel alive again. He had been through a lot that year. Just weeks earlier, his mother, Renee, had died suddenly of a rare blood cancer. Her death had shattered him, but his friends said he was trying to stay strong. He still smiled, still joked, still talked about the future, about proposing to his girlfriend, Alexis, and escaping to a beach somewhere after finals. That night, he went out for drinks and then he disappeared, without a trace. Brian started the evening with his father, Randy, having dinner at a local steakhouse. They talked about school, about his mother, about plans for the break. Randy said Brian seemed tired, but in good spirits. After dinner, Brian met up with his friend Clint Florence, another med student. They started bar hopping, first at the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a popular bar in Columbus's short North District. Then a few more places nearby. By 1 a.m. they were back where they started, the Ugly Tuna. Security cameras captured them laughing, drinking, and talking with 2 women they'd met that night. Then, around 1:55 a.m., Brian is seen on camera, walking out of the bar's main entrance and up the escalator toward the street. He appears to say goodbye to the women, then turns to walk back toward the bar. And then, nothing. That's the last time anyone ever saw Brian Shaffer. When his friends left around 2:10 a.m., they assumed Brian had gone home early. He didn't answer calls or texts that night. When he didn't show up for a planned trip to Miami with his girlfriend 2 days later, panic set in. Police began their search immediately. They reviewed hours of CCTV footage from inside and outside the bar. Brian was clearly seen entering the Ugly Tuna at 1:15 a.m. He was clearly seen stepping outside around 1:55, but he was never seen leaving the building again, not through the main exit, not through the back door, not through the stairwell or loading dock, nowhere. It was as if he'd walked into the bar and vanished into air. Detectives scoured the entire building, from the bar to the roof to the service tunnels below. They searched dumpsters, crawl spaces, nearby alleys and sewers. They even tore apart parts of the construction site next door, where the area was being renovated. Nothing. No blood, no footprints, no signs of a struggle. Just absence. The more they watched the security footage, the more bizarre it became. The ugly tuner was located at the end of a dead-end corridor, with one main entrance and a service door for staff. Cameras covered both. There was no way for Brian to leave without being caught on film, unless he disguised himself, or slipped through some unmonitored exit, or never left the building at all. That's when theories began to spiral. Some thought he was the victim of foul play, robbed, attacked, hidden somewhere nearby. Others suspected he'd suffered a breakdown, still grieving his mother's death, and chosen to disappear voluntarily. Then there were stranger theories, that he'd gone into the maintenance tunnels beneath the building and drowned in the flood-prone sewer system, or that he'd climbed onto the roof and fallen into an unsearched area. But none of it explained one simple fact. His cell phone continued to ring for days after he vanished. On September 8th, nearly 5 months later, Brian's phone pinged a cell tower near Marysville, Ohio, 14 miles away. It didn't lead anywhere, but it reignited hope that he was alive. Police later said it was probably just a glitch, the result of a powered-on phone re-registering to the network. But to his family, it felt like a heartbeat, a sign he might still be out there. Investigators questioned everyone who'd been with him that night. His friend Clint was interviewed several times, but his answers were inconsistent. He refused to take a polygraph test. So did another friend. Brian's girlfriend Alexis took one voluntarily. She passed. She called his phone every day for months, until it finally went straight to voicemail. In one of her interviews, she said something that stuck with everyone. If Brian was alive, he'd never do this to me. He'd never do this to his family. For Brian's father, Randy, the search became a full-time mission. He handed out flyers, hired private investigators, and followed every tip. Psychics, police dogs, online sleuths. Everyone wanted to solve the mystery. No one could. He even left a light burning on the porch of Brian's apartment every night, just in case his son found his way home. Years passed. Nothing changed. Then, in 2008, tragedy struck again. Randy Shaffer was cleaning debris after a storm when a tree branch fell and killed him instantly. At his funeral, friends noticed something strange. On the online obituary page, an anonymous post appeared. "Dad, I love you. Brian, U.S. Virgin Islands." Police traced the comment's IP address. It came from a public computer in Franklin County, Ohio. Not the Virgin Islands. The message was never traced to a suspect. Today, almost 2 decades later, Brian Shaffer's disappearance remains one of the most baffling cases in modern history. There is no evidence of death, no confirmed sightings, and no physical trace, not a single piece of clothing, not a single personal item. He simply walked into a bar and ceased to exist. Some believe he's still alive, that he faked his death, started over, and built a new life somewhere far away. But most believe something darker happened that night. Something hidden within those missing minutes between the last recorded frame and the silence that followed. What could erase a man so completely in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras? It's the kind of mystery that gnaws at logic and haunts anyone who studies it. To this day, detectives occasionally revisit the case, combing through old footage, re-interviewing witnesses. Every new theory leads back to the same dead end, the door he never walked out of. Brian Shaffer's story has become a modern legend, not because of what's known, but because of what isn't. It's not just that he disappeared, it's that he did so in a world where no one's supposed to vanish anymore. And yet sometimes the strangest mysteries don't happen in jungles or oceans. They happen under fluorescent lights, in the middle of a crowd, in a moment caught on camera. And as baffling as Brian's case is, the next disappearance on our list pushes that same impossibility even further. A pilot flying through clear skies, reporting something strange above him. His final transmission still chills investigators to this day. He said, "It's not an aircraft." Moments later, his plane vanished. The case of Brian Shaffer leaves us with one of the most baffling modern vanishings. A man swallowed by an ordinary night. But our next mystery takes us somewhere far more open, far more chilling, the empty sky. Because in 1978, an Australian pilot radioed that something strange was following him. Then, mid-sentence, he disappeared. October 21st, 1978, the sun had just begun to set over southern Australia. 20-year-old Frederick Valentich climbed into his small Cessna 182L aircraft at Moorabbin Airport near Melbourne. He was young but experienced, over 150 flying hours logged. That evening, he planned a routine trip across the Bass Strait, the stretch of ocean separating mainland Australia from Tasmania. His destination? King Island. It should have been a simple flight. A calm evening, clear weather, full fuel tank, nothing out of the ordinary. But 23 minutes after takeoff, Frederick radioed air traffic control in Melbourne. His voice was steady, calm, at first. "Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. Is there any known traffic below 5,000? The controller replied, "No known traffic." A short pause. Frederick's voice returned. "Seems to be a large aircraft below 5,000. The controller asked him to identify it. "I can't tell what it is," he said. "It's moving fast, and it's just passed over me." For the next 6 minutes, their conversation grew stranger and more tense. Frederick reported that the object was circling him. He described it as long, metallic, with a green light that seemed to glow around it. "It's not an aircraft," he said quietly. The controller asked him to confirm, but before he could, Valentich added something odd. "Now it's orbiting above me. It's got a shiny surface." Then silence, followed by a low, metallic scraping sound over the radio, 17 seconds of it, and then nothing. No mayday call, no static, just the open channel of the Australian sky. When Frederick failed to arrive on King Island, emergency searches began immediately. Aircraft from the Royal Australian Air Force scoured the strait through the night and the following days. No wreckage, no oil slick, no body, no sign of the Cessna. It was as if both pilot and plane had been erased mid-air. Frederick Valentich was declared missing, presumed dead. But the questions surrounding his final flight turned his case into one of the most debated aviation mysteries in history. Because what exactly did he see? Investigators dug into his background. He was a devoted aviation enthusiast, obsessed with flight, but he also had a fascination with UFOs. He read about them constantly, discussed them with friends, and once told his girlfriend he believed in life beyond Earth. Some claimed he might have been chasing something he imagined. Others said he panicked after mistaking a reflection or bright light for another craft. But the details didn't fit so neatly. His radio call was calm, measured, consistent with a trained pilot's tone under pressure, and the metallic scraping captured on the tape. Experts couldn't identify it. It wasn't engine failure. It wasn't interference. It was something else. A few days after the disappearance, several witnesses along the southern coast reported seeing strange lights moving rapidly over the sea that night. A plumber driving near Cape Otway described a green light moving erratically. A farmer said his cows scattered when a silent, glowing craft passed overhead. The Australian Department of Transport logged these sightings but dismissed them as unrelated. Atmospheric phenomena, perhaps. But UFO researchers weren't convinced. To them, Valentich's calm final words, "It's not an aircraft," were the ultimate clue. They believed he had encountered something unexplainable, perhaps even been taken. His plane, they said, was simply gone. Skeptics offered a simpler explanation. Some suggested Frederick was flying inverted, upside down, and had mistaken the reflection of his own plane's lights in the water for a craft. In that position, his altimeter would have read incorrectly. Disoriented, he could have crashed into the ocean without realizing how low he was. It's plausible, but it doesn't explain why his body, or any part of the plane, was never found. The Bass Strait has claimed many aircraft over the years, yes, but most leave a trace. Frederick left none. In 1983, 5 years later, an engine cowl flap, a small piece of aircraft metal, washed ashore on Flinders Island, 200 kilometers from Valentich's flight path. Serial numbers were corroded, but it matched the type used on his model of Cessna. Authorities couldn't confirm it definitively, but it was enough to reopen debate. Had the plane disintegrated? Had it sunk whole into one of the deep trenches of the Bass Strait? Or had it gone somewhere else entirely? Frederick's father, Guido Valentich, refused to believe his son had crashed. He said Frederick wasn't suicidal, wasn't careless, and knew those skies better than anyone. He told reporters, "He told me he would be taken someday, not by accident, but by them." Years later, Guido said he still received phone calls. No voice, just silence on the line. He believed it was his son reaching out somehow. For decades, Valentich's story has hovered between science and myth. UFO researchers cite it as proof of extraterrestrial contact. Skeptics see it as a tragic accident wrapped in coincidence. But everyone agrees on one thing. The recording is real. It remains one of the eeriest audio logs in aviation history. Those final 17 seconds of metallic sound still make investigators uneasy. Some describe it as a mechanical distortion. Others say it sounds alive. In 2012, newly digitized radar data offered one more tantalizing clue. Analysts found faint readings suggesting another object, one that appeared to move in tight circles, near Valentich's plane at the exact time of the transmission. Too faint to identify, but there. Was it another aircraft, a trick of the radar, or something entirely unknown? No one knows. Whatever happened over the Bass Strait that October evening, Frederick Valentich's name is now inseparable from it. The young pilot who vanished mid-sentence, mid-sky, chasing a light no one else could see. His empty flight path remains one of Australia's deepest mysteries, the kind that stretches the boundary between science, faith, and imagination. And while his disappearance took place high above the earth, our next mystery returns us firmly to the ground, and into the strange, shadowed life of someone who made her living creating mysteries of her own. Because in 1926, the most famous crime novelist in the world vanished, leaving behind an abandoned car, a missing note, and a story no detective could solve. Her name was Agatha Christie. Frederick Valentich's disappearance left behind only static, mystery, and speculation. A story half finished in the clouds. But our next vanishing act takes place on solid ground. A winter night in England. A famous name, a missing car, and an entire nation searching for a woman who, ironically, made her living writing mysteries. This is the disappearance of Agatha Christie, and it reads like something straight out of her own novels. It was Friday, December 3rd, 1926. The night air was bitter and damp, the kind that carried fog through the English countryside. At her home in Berkshire, Agatha Christie kissed her 7-year-old daughter Rosalind goodnight. Then she walked out the front door and vanished. The next morning, her Morris Cowley car was found abandoned near a chalk quarry outside the town of Guildford. Inside, her fur coat, her driver's license, and an expired passport. But no sign of Agatha. Her disappearance made headlines overnight. This wasn't just anyone. This was one of the most famous authors in the world, already adored for her sharp detective stories like The Mysterious Affair at Styles and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. The Queen of Crime, as she was known, had written about murders, disappearances, and deceit. But no one expected her to star in one. The police mounted one of the largest manhunts in British history. Over 1,000 officers were deployed, hundreds of volunteers combed the countryside, airplanes were even sent overhead, a first for a missing person case in England. They searched lakes, rivers, woods, and abandoned buildings. Divers explored the silent pool, a deep pond not far from where her car had been found. For 11 days there was nothing, no sightings, no notes, no word. Newspapers went wild, theories multiplied. Some said she had suffered a breakdown after learning her husband, Colonel Archibald Christie, was having an affair. Others whispered it was all a publicity stunt, a master mystery writer crafting her own headline. A few even accused her husband of murder. The story consumed the nation. Then, on the night of December 14th, the mystery broke in the most unexpected way. A man staying at a luxury spa hotel in Harrogate in northern England recognized a familiar face among the guests. A quiet woman, stylish but withdrawn, had been staying there under the name Mrs. Teresa Neal. When confronted, she admitted the truth. She was Agatha Christie, alive, safe, and completely unable to explain what had happened. According to her own account, she had no memory of the 11 missing days. She claimed she'd been suffering from amnesia, brought on by depression, stress, and exhaustion. Her mother had died earlier that year. Her marriage was collapsing. She said she'd driven away that night in a fog of grief and confusion, and simply forgot who she was. At the Harrogate Hotel, she'd signed in using the last name of her husband's mistress, Neal. A coincidence that tabloids found too good to believe. The official explanation, even now, remains unclear. Was it truly amnesia? Or something else? Something deliberate? Some biographers believe she staged her disappearance as a form of revenge, a way to humiliate her husband, forcing him to face public suspicion and panic. He was, after all, the first person suspected when her car was found. Others say it was a mental breakdown, that she suffered what today might be diagnosed as a fugue state, a rare dissociative condition triggered by trauma. It would explain her blank memory, her altered identity, and her strange calmness at the hotel. But to many, it felt like one of her own plots brought to life, a perfect mystery with no satisfying ending. When the truth, or at least part of it, came out, the public was divided. Some were angry, feeling deceived by a hoax. Others were simply relieved she was alive. Agatha herself rarely spoke about those days again. In her autobiography written decades later, she devoted only a few brief lines to the incident, calling it a nervous breakdown of sorts. But even then her tone was detached, as though the missing days belonged to someone else entirely. The fallout from her disappearance changed her life forever. She divorced Archibald the following year and later married archaeologist Max Mallowan, with whom she travelled across the Middle East, journeys that would inspire some of her most famous novels. Her work grew even darker after 1926, more psychological, more introspective. She began to explore themes of memory, guilt, and hidden motives, as if, somewhere deep down, she was still writing about herself. There's one detail from those missing days that still gives researchers pause. A chambermaid from the Harrogate Hotel later claimed that Mrs. Neal had spent her evenings quietly reading in the lounge, copies of Agatha Christie's own novels. She would smile, sometimes laugh to herself, but never say much. If true, it's a haunting image, the world's greatest mystery writer reading her own mysteries while the entire nation searched for her. In the years that followed, her fame only grew. She became the best-selling novelist of all time, second only to the Bible and Shakespeare. And yet, despite all her fame, her 1926 disappearance remains the one story she never solved. It's a tale that perfectly blurs the line between fact and fiction, a woman who built her career unraveling mysteries, suddenly becoming one. And perhaps that's why it still lingers. Not because of what was found, but because of what never was. A car by a chalk pit, a name in a hotel ledger, and 11 missing days no one could ever fully explain. Some mysteries are written, others are lived. And Agatha Christie's was both. But as strange as her vanishing was, it pales next to our next case, one that seems simple on paper but remains utterly unsolved. A young woman hiking alone on a cold December day in Vermont and never coming back. Her disappearance didn't just baffle police, it changed how the entire state handles missing persons. This is the story of Paula Jean Welden. Agatha Christie's vanishing might have captivated the entire world. But what came next was quieter, lonelier, and far more haunting. Because in this next story, there were no headlines to hide behind, no novels to decode. Just a girl in a red coat, a forest trail, and the kind of silence that swallows answers whole. This is the story of Paula Jean Welden, and the day she went for a walk and never returned. It was December 1st, 1946. The snow hadn't yet fallen, but winter was already creeping through Vermont. In the small college town of Bennington, 18-year-old Paula Welden was finishing up her second semester at Bennington College. She was smart, independent, and curious, studying art and design but restless with a quiet sense of wanting more. Her roommate said she'd been unusually thoughtful that weekend, skipping dinner plans and lying on her bed, reading a travel book about hiking and the outdoors. Then, sometime that afternoon, she put the book down, stood up, and said something simple. "I think I'll take a walk." She put on a red parka, blue jeans, and sneakers, light clothing for a cold evening. And then she stepped out of her dorm room, leaving behind her money, her identification, and everything else she owned. That was the last anyone saw of her. At first, no one worried. Bennington was small, safe, the kind of town where students often hiked nearby trails alone. The Long Trail, a 270-mile footpath that winds through the Green Mountains, started just a few miles from campus. Paula had mentioned wanting to see it. By the next morning, when she hadn't returned, her roommates alerted the college staff. Calls were made, but there was still no sign of her. Then her parents arrived. Frantic, confused, desperate. Her father, William Archibald Welden, was a well-known engineer in Connecticut. He immediately offered a reward for information, and with that, the search began. For days, hundreds of volunteers, police officers, and even U.S. Army soldiers combed the surrounding woods. They searched trails, streams, and abandoned cabins. Locals said they saw her, or thought they did. One lumberjack claimed he'd given directions to a young woman matching her description near the entrance to the Long Trail that afternoon. Another said he'd seen her walking north toward Glastonbury Mountain just before dusk. But beyond that there was nothing, No footprints, no torn clothing, no sign of a struggle, just the forest. The case quickly became national news. How could a girl simply vanish on a popular hiking trail in daylight? There were no wild animals reported, no criminal activity, no weather event to blame. It was as if she'd stepped into another world. Her father refused to accept that she was simply lost. He believed she'd met with foul play, that someone in the area had taken her. He accused the local police of incompetence, even corruption, claiming they'd mishandled early evidence and ignored leads. And, in a way, he wasn't wrong. At the time, Vermont didn't even have a state police force. Each county handled investigations separately, often with little coordination or resources. Paula's case exposed just how unprepared local authorities were for large-scale searches. Her disappearance would change that forever. In the weeks that followed, every theory imaginable surfaced. Some said she'd run away to start a new life. Others thought she'd become lost, succumbed to exposure, and been buried under winter snow. Then there were stranger theories. Locals whispered about the Bennington Triangle, a mysterious area in southwestern Vermont where people seemed to vanish without explanation. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 people disappeared within a 30-mile radius of Glastonbury Mountain, the same region where Paula was last seen. A veteran hunter, a guide, even a young boy. All gone. No bodies, no evidence, just absence. Some said the land itself was cursed. Others said it was magnetic anomalies or sudden weather shifts. But to many, Paula's case marked the beginning of that legend. Her father pursued every clue, even traveling across the country, chasing rumors. One tip led him to a waitress in Massachusetts who matched his daughter's description. Another claimed Paula had been seen boarding a bus to Canada. None of them panned out. Eventually, her father accused one local man, a laborer, who'd reportedly argued with his girlfriend near the Long Trail that same evening, but with no evidence, no body, and no confession, there was nothing police could do. The man moved away soon after. Months turned into years. The trail grew colder. The red parka, as that single, vivid detail everyone remembered, became a symbol of the case. Searchers would say they dreamed of it at night, hoping one day they'd find it in the brush, or hanging from a branch somewhere deep in the woods. They never did. Paula's disappearance didn't just haunt Bennington, it changed Vermont. The public outrage and criticism following her case led directly to the creation of the Vermont State Police in 1947. It was the state's first centralized investigative agency, formed to prevent another case from falling through bureaucratic cracks. Her legacy, though tragic, reshaped how missing persons were handled forever. Today, hikers still visit the same path Paula once walked, the Long Trail near Glastonbury Mountain. It's peaceful, beautiful, but eerily quiet. Locals say you can still feel something there, a stillness that doesn't belong to the wind. And every so often someone claims to see a flicker of red deep in the trees, a flash of color that vanishes when you turn your head. They say it's just a trick of light. But sometimes in the cold silence of the Vermont woods, it's hard not to wonder. Paula Jean Welden's case remains officially unsolved. No evidence, no suspects, no closure, just a missing girl who set out for a walk and never came home. And while her story feels rooted in the isolation of a small town, our next disappearance unfolds in a far more crowded place, surrounded by friends, cameras, and modern technology. Yet, even there, in plain sight, someone managed to vanish completely. Because 65 years later, another young woman would walk into the night and simply cease to exist. This is the story of Lauren Spierer. Paula Jean Welden disappeared in a time when technology was barely there. No cameras, no phones, no GPS. But our next story takes place in the age of smartphones, surveillance, and social media. a world where it should be impossible for someone to just vanish. And yet, in the early hours of June 3rd, 2011, a 20-year-old college student named Lauren Spierer did exactly that. In the middle of a city, surrounded by people, caught on camera, right up until she wasn't. It was a Friday night in Bloomington, Indiana, a typical college town, alive with noise and summer air. Lauren, a petite blonde with a big personality, was a fashion major at Indiana University. She was well-liked, outgoing, the kind of person who never walked into a room unnoticed. That night, she joined friends for a night out. They drank, laughed, danced, the kind of evening that feels ordinary until it isn't. Between 1:30 and 4 a.m., Lauren was seen at several bars and apartments across town. Every movement she made was captured on grainy security cameras, walking, laughing, sometimes stumbling, and then she was gone. It was the last confirmed sighting of Lauren Spierer came at 4:30 a.m. on the corner of 11th Street and College Avenue. Barefoot, carrying her phone and keys, she was walking toward her apartment just a few blocks away, but she never made it home. When her boyfriend, Jesse Wolfe, couldn't reach her the next morning, he called police. Her friends assumed she'd slept somewhere nearby, but by noon, when calls went straight to voicemail, panic began to set in. By evening, the search for Lauren had already started, and quickly grew massive. Police, volunteers, dogs, and divers scoured Bloomington. Flyers went up across campus. Helicopters hovered overhead. Her parents, Charlene and Robert Spierer, flew in from New York the same day. They refused to leave until she was found. Lauren's night was reconstructed minute by minute, every step, every person she encountered. She had started at a popular bar called Kilroy's on Kirkwood, where she left her shoes and phone behind, possibly intoxicated. She was escorted out shortly after 2 a.m. From there, she visited several friends' apartments, including one belonging to a man named Corey Rossman. At one point, she reportedly fell and hit her head. Friends later said she appeared disoriented but refused help. A neighbor confronted Corey for bringing her home in that state. An argument broke out, and Corey claimed he was punched and lost memory of what happened next. Security cameras later caught Lauren walking alone near 11th and College, around 4:30 a.m. She turned a corner and disappeared from view. After that, nothing. In the days that followed, the case became national news. Thousands of tips flooded in. Search teams combed the woods, rivers, and dumpsters. Every friend who saw her that night was questioned repeatedly. But with every passing day, the picture grew more complicated. There was no sign of forced abduction, no suspicious vehicle on camera, no trace of her clothes, keys, or jewelry. Her phone had been left behind, her credit cards untouched. Lauren had simply vanished in the heart of a modern city, as if the ground itself swallowed her whole. The friends she was with that night quickly came under scrutiny. They lawyered up almost immediately, refusing to take polygraphs under police supervision. Some claimed they'd already passed private tests. Others gave conflicting accounts about when they last saw her. The public's suspicion turned to them, fueled by speculation, rumors, and silence. But without evidence, no body, no crime scene, no eyewitness, there was little police could do. Theories multiplied. Some believed Lauren had succumbed to intoxication and fallen into a nearby creek. Others believed she'd been picked up by someone she knew, perhaps accidentally overdosed, and that her body was disposed of. There were even darker whispers of human trafficking or organized cover-ups involving powerful families. But every theory hit the same wall. No proof. Lauren's parents never stopped searching. They stood in front of cameras, pleading for answers. They hired private investigators, sifted through thousands of tips, and even offered large rewards. But as the years passed, their tone shifted, from desperate hope to quiet endurance. Charlene Spierer once said in an interview, "Someone knows, someone always knows." In 2016, 5 years after Lauren's disappearance, the FBI searched a property connected to one of the men she'd been with that night. Dogs detected possible traces of human decomposition, but nothing definitive was ever found. No charges were filed. It was yet another dead end. To this day, no one has ever been charged or even officially named a suspect in Lauren Spierer's case. Her body has never been found. Her disappearance remains open, a wound that never healed. And for Bloomington, it was a harsh reminder that even in a world of constant surveillance, people can still vanish completely. All it takes is one corner without a camera. One moment out of sight. Every year on June 3rd, students at Indiana University gather at the spot where Lauren was last seen. They leave flowers, candles, sometimes a pair of shoes. A silent tribute to a girl who walked less than a mile and never came home. Lauren's story, like so many before her, shows that mystery isn't always ancient. It's alive, walking among us, caught on camera 1 second and gone the next. But our next disappearance takes us away from city lights, away from the modern age, back into the fog of wartime Europe, where one man's vanishing act became a legend of its own. Because in 1944, a world-famous musician boarded a plane bound for Paris and was never heard from again. This is the story of Glenn Miller. Lauren Spierer's case proved that even in a world wired with cameras, people can still slip through the cracks of reality. But our next story comes from an era before radar, GPS, or black boxes, when the sky itself could swallow you whole. It's December 15th, 1944. Europe is at war, and one of the most famous men in America, a musician whose songs lifted soldiers' spirits through the darkest days of World War II, steps aboard a small aircraft bound for France. He waves goodbye and vanishes. This is the story of Glenn Miller, the band leader who disappeared into the clouds. By the time of his disappearance, Glenn Miller wasn't just a musician, he was an American icon. His swing orchestra defined an era. In the Mood, Moonlight Serenade, Chattanooga Choo Choo, these weren't just songs, they were anthems for a generation living through chaos. Miller's music was morale. He had left behind fame and fortune in the US to serve his country, enlisting in the Army Air Forces in 1942. His mission was simple: bring music and a sense of home to soldiers stationed overseas. By late 1944, Europe was finally turning in the Allies' favor. Miller's orchestra was preparing to perform in newly liberated Paris for Christmas. And so, on that cold December morning, Glenn boarded a UC-64 Norseman, a single-engine military transport plane. Destination: Paris. Weather: poor. He was never seen again. The flight took off from RAF Twinwood Farm near Bedford, England, around 1:55 p.m. The small plane carried only 3 men: the pilot, flight officer, John Morgan, passenger Lieutenant Colonel Norman Basil, and Glenn Miller himself. Their route should have been short, about 90 minutes across the English Channel, but sometime over the water, in freezing fog and worsening visibility, the aircraft vanished from radar. No radio distress call, no debris, nothing. It simply never arrived. At first, the US military downplayed the event. War was raging. Thousands of soldiers were dying daily, and a missing musician wasn't top priority. Official word didn't reach the public until weeks later. Major Glenn Miller, missing in action. When the news broke, it stunned the world. Miller wasn't just another entertainer. He was the sound of hope. The man who made America dance through the Depression. The bandleader who followed his orchestra into battlefields and bomb shelters. Now, he was gone. the search for answers began immediately, and it hasn't stopped since. The official theory was simple. The plane went down over the channel due to bad weather and icing. The Norseman wasn't designed for heavy fog or freezing rain. A single clogged carburetor or iced-up wing could have sent it spiraling into the sea. But what kept the mystery alive was what didn't surface. No wreckage, no bodies, not a single trace, even after extensive searches, as if the ocean had simply erased them. Then came the rumors, and they were extraordinary. One claimed that Miller's plane had been accidentally hit by bombs jettisoned from returning Allied aircraft. That day, several Royal Air Force bombers returning from an aborted mission over Germany were ordered to dump their unused explosives over the channel before landing. Years later, one veteran claimed he saw a small plane flying below their formation at that exact time and watched in horror as it was caught in the blast zone. The RAF dismissed the account as hearsay, but others took it seriously. Could the greatest band leader in the world have been killed by friendly fire? Other theories were darker. In the 1980s, whispers began to circulate that Glenn Miller hadn't died in a crash at all, that he had safely arrived in Paris, only to die under scandalous circumstances. A British journalist claimed that Miller suffered a fatal heart attack in a Paris brothel, and that the US government covered it up to preserve morale. The story spread quickly, fueled by the absence of evidence, but official military logs and eyewitness statements strongly contradict it. Miller was never recorded as arriving in France that day. His name simply vanished from the flight manifest. Mid-air, mid-war, mid-history. Then came a discovery that reignited hope. In 1987, a fisherman off the English coast pulled up a twisted hunk of aluminum from his nets. It was later identified as part of a UC-64 Norseman, the same type of aircraft Miller had been flying in. The piece was found in roughly the same area his plane would have traveled. But it wasn't enough. The serial number was corroded, unreadable, and without that there was no proof it belonged to his plane. Just another fragment of metal, another unanswered question. For decades, amateur researchers, divers, and aviation experts have tried to locate the wreck. None have succeeded. Even advanced sonar scans of the channel floor have turned up nothing definitive. It's as if the plane, even the man who made the world dance, dissolved into myth. And yet, perhaps the strangest part of all is how peaceful Miller's final hours might have been. The pilot, John Morgan, was an experienced flyer, but he wasn't authorized to make that trip. The weather had grounded other aircraft that day, but Miller's sense of duty pushed him forward. He had promised the soldiers in Paris a Christmas concert. He wouldn't let them down. He had faced death before, not with a gun, but with a trombone in hand, playing to men who might not live to see another sunrise. So when he boarded that small plane into freezing fog, he probably did it the way he'd always lived. Calm, focused, unshaken. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was chasing purpose. Glenn Miller's wife, Helen, never remarried. She kept his awards, his instruments, and the letters he wrote home from Europe. Until her death in 1966, she held on to one belief, that his plane went down quickly, and that he didn't suffer. For her, that was enough. For historians, it wasn't. And so the search continues in archives, in seabeds, in fading memories of old pilots and fishermen, because some mysteries refuse to stay buried, especially when they're wrapped in the sound of a generation. Today, Glenn Miller's music still drifts through time like an echo from another world. You can hear it in old dance halls, in movies, in the crackle of vinyls spinning on a record player. But maybe the real reason his songs endure is because they never got their ending. The man who brought rhythm to a world at war took one final flight and vanished into silence. And as that silence lingers, our next disappearance takes us far from Europe to the jungles and mist-covered hills of Malaysia. There, another man with a double life, businessman, spy, and legend, walked into the woods one sunny afternoon and was never seen again. This is the story of Jim Thompson, the Thai Silk King. Glenn Miller disappeared into the sky, gone with the clouds, his fate lost somewhere over the English Channel, but the man in our next story vanished on solid ground, a walk in the sunlight, a turn down a forest path, and then nothing. This is the story of Jim Thompson, the American spy turned silk tycoon who stepped into the Malaysian highlands and never returned. By the 1960s, Jim Thompson was more than just a name. He was a legend. A former architect, a World War II intelligence officer, and later the man who almost single-handedly revived the Thai silk industry. His fabrics draped Hollywood stars, adorned fashion houses, and lined the walls of royal palaces. Bangkok adored him. He was charismatic, mysterious, and had a way of turning everything he touched into gold. His home, a striking mix of traditional Thai architecture and modern elegance, became a gathering place for diplomats, artists, and spies alike. Because Jim Thompson wasn't just a businessman, he was a man with secrets. Before his silk empire, he'd served in the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that would later become the CIA. Stationed in Southeast Asia during World War II, Thompson had dealt in information, alliances, and shadowy connections that few ever fully understood. After the war, he chose not to return to America. He stayed in Thailand, a neutral ground between worlds, and built a new life. But even in his success, there were whispers that he was still working for the US government, that he knew too much, that he'd made enemies, both political and personal. On March 26, 1967, Jim Thompson arrived in the Cameron Highlands of Malaysia for a short Easter vacation. He was staying with friends, a wealthy British couple, Dr. and Mrs. Ling, at their Tudor-style cottage surrounded by tea plantations and rainforest. The afternoon was peaceful, a small lunch, casual conversation. Then at around 3 p.m., Thompson decided to take a walk. He stepped out wearing a casual shirt, khaki pants and sandals. No jacket, no bag, no wallet. Just a short walk before tea. That was the plan. He never came back. At first, no one panicked. The highlands were safe, the trails well trodden. But as dusk fell and there was still no sign of him, concern turned to alarm. By nightfall, local police were notified, and within 24 hours one of the largest search operations in Malaysian history was underway. Hundreds of soldiers, police officers, trackers and volunteers scoured the jungle. Helicopters hovered overhead. Dogs were brought in from Kuala Lumpur. They found footprints, broken branches, vague trail, but none that led anywhere. It was as if Jim Thompson had walked into the forest and dissolved. The region he vanished in wasn't large, just a few square miles of steep valleys and thick vegetation. Searchers covered every possible route, even nearby villages. No signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no blood, no body. Days turned into weeks. And with every passing hour, the theories grew stranger. Some said it was an accident, that he'd lost his footing on a steep hill and been swept away by a river. Others pointed to his age, 61, and speculated that he might have collapsed from exhaustion. But rescuers argued that if he'd fallen, they would have found something, a shoe, a bone, anything. There was nothing. Then came the darker theories. The first linked him to espionage. Rumors circulated that Thompson had been secretly reactivated by the CIA, perhaps keeping tabs on regional political movements during the Vietnam War. Others believed he'd stumbled onto something, information that made him a target, a kidnapping, an assassination, a cover-up. None of it could be proven. Another rumor, but more personal. claimed Thompson's disappearance was no accident at all, that he'd planned it, that he was tired of fame, of business, of the endless questions about his past. He'd simply walked away, starting a new life under a new name. But if that were true, where did he go, and how could a man that famous simply vanish in an age of passports, money, and connections? In the months that followed, the case became an international obsession. Newspapers across the world covered it daily. "The mystery of the missing Silk King," the headlines read. Even the US government got involved, though quietly. Agents from the CIA and State Department reportedly reviewed his records, but their findings were never made public. By the end of 1967, the official search was called off. The jungle had given no answers, but the mystery didn't end there. In 1974, 7 years after Thompson vanished, a skeleton was found buried in a shallow grave about 30 miles from where he disappeared. For a moment, the world thought the mystery was solved, but forensic testing ruled it out. The bones belonged to a local tribesman, not Jim Thompson. And in the decades that followed, new sightings of him were reported across Asia. Singapore, Bali, even Thailand. All unverified. His family eventually declared him legally dead in 1976, but to this day, no one knows what really happened that afternoon in the Cameron Highlands. The silence of the forest became his tomb, or perhaps his escape. If you visit the area today, local guides will still point out the path where he was last seen. The trail fades into ferns and shadows, the air heavy with mist. It's quiet, too quiet, and some say if you stand there long enough you'll hear footsteps crunching on the leaves behind you, but when you turn around, there's no one there. Back in Bangkok, his house still stands, perfectly preserved, a museum now, polished teak floors, ancient Buddhist relics, red silk curtains glowing in filtered sunlight. It feels as if he'd just stepped out for a moment, perhaps for a walk, and will be back any second. But he never was. Jim Thompson's disappearance remains one of Southeast Asia's greatest unsolved mysteries. No evidence, no closure, just a man who once knew all the world's secrets, and then became one himself. And while Thompson's story vanished into the jungles of Malaysia, our next mystery unfolds in the surf and spray of the Australian coast, where even a nation's prime minister could step into the ocean one afternoon and never come back. This is the disappearance of Harold Holt, 1967, the man who went swimming and never returned. Jim Thompson's disappearance left behind questions whispered through jungles and embassies, and what happened next would send shockwaves through the world's headlines, because the next man to vanish wasn't a traveler or an explorer. He was the leader of a nation. In December of 1967, Harold Holt, the Prime Minister of Australia, walked into the ocean and never came out. No scandal, no farewell, no explanation, just the surf, the waves, and silence. On the morning of December 17, 1967, Harold Holt woke early in his beach house in Portsea, Victoria, a picturesque coastal town southwest of Melbourne. The day was warm, the sea glittering under the summer sun. Holt loved the water. He was an athletic man, 59 years old, but still known for his boundless energy. He surfed, he spearfished, he swam every day. The sea, to him, was freedom, a place where politics and pressure couldn't reach. That morning, he invited a few friends to join him for a casual outing to Cheviot Beach, a rugged stretch of coastline beneath steep limestone cliffs. It wasn't a public beach. It belonged to a restricted military zone known for strong tides and unpredictable surf. But Holt knew the area well. He'd swum there many times before. At around 12:15 p.m., under a bright sky, he entered the water. His friends watched from shore as he waded in, chest deep, then further, toward the breaking waves. A few seconds later, he was gone. At first, no one understood what had happened. They waited, scanning the waterline for his familiar stroke. But there was nothing, just churning foam and crashing surf. One friend shouted, another dove in, but the current was too strong. Within minutes, panic turned to horror. By 12:30 p.m., police and lifeguards had been alerted. Within an hour, helicopters circled overhead and rescue boats combed the water. Dozens of divers entered the surf, fighting the pull of the ocean. But the waves were relentless. By nightfall, it was clear Harold Holt, the sitting Prime Minister of Australia, had vanished. The official search was one of the largest in the nation's history. Over 340 personnel, including Navy divers, Air Force pilots, and local fishermen, participated. For days they searched, dredging every reef, cave, and cove, but the ocean gave up nothing. No body, no clothing, no trace. The only thing that remained was a mystery and a growing storm of speculation. Australia and the world was stunned. No other Western leader had ever disappeared like this. One day he was running the country, the next he was gone without a trace. The government scrambled to respond. Within 48 hours, John McEwen, Deputy Prime Minister, was sworn in as acting leader. Parliament paid tribute. Flags were lowered. The beaches remained closed. But the people weren't ready to let go, because something about the story didn't make sense. Holt was known for his love of the ocean, yes, but also for his recklessness in it. He'd been caught in strong currents before, even rescued once by lifeguards. Friends recalled his confidence in rough seas, his refusal to acknowledge danger. And yet that day the surf was particularly violent. Waves were over 3 meters high and the undertow was fierce. Some experts later called it suicidal to swim there at all. So why did he go in? Theories soon flooded in, each one stranger than the last. The simplest claimed that Holt drowned, dragged out by the current, his body swept away by the tides, or trapped in underwater caves. Sharks, decomposing currents, or the ocean's depth might have ensured he was never found. It was tragic, but plausible. Yet others weren't convinced. A few claimed it was an elaborate suicide. They pointed to the enormous stress Holt was under, politically and personally. Australia was deeply divided over its involvement in the Vietnam War, which Holt had strongly supported. At home, he faced mounting criticism. Some even suggested he was depressed, though friends and family denied it fiercely. Then came the more exotic theories, the kind that turned tragedy into legend. One of the most popular conspiracies claimed Holt was a Chinese spy, extracted by submarine. According to this story, the Prime Minister had been secretly working with Beijing during the Cold War. On that day, a waiting submarine surfaced off Cheviot Beach and took him away. No body, no trace, perfect cover. Of course, there's no evidence of any of this. The theory was fueled by paranoia and Cold War anxiety, not fact, but it stuck. It even inspired the 1983 comedy film The Return of Captain Invincible, which joked about Holt being abducted by aliens. Yes, aliens. Because even that theory found traction in fringe circles. Others went for the romantic angle, that Holt had faked his death and started a new life abroad, perhaps in Paris or Singapore. But Holt was one of the most recognizable figures in Australia. It would have been impossible to disappear unnoticed. Still, people wanted an ending that wasn't just, he drowned. In 2005, nearly 4 decades later, the mystery resurfaced. When divers revisited the area, new sonar equipment mapped the seabed and confirmed the danger. Swirling riptides, jagged rock ledges, and underwater caves deep enough to trap a body indefinitely. It seemed to support the official conclusion. an accidental drowning. And yet, not a single definitive clue was ever recovered. In 1968, an official inquest finally declared that Holt had drowned due to accidental causes, but it couldn't answer why his body had never surfaced, or why no debris had been found. The mystery, like the man, stayed under the waves. Harold Holt's disappearance left Australia shaken, not just because of what was lost, but because of what it represented, that even power, even leadership, can vanish without warning. He wasn't assassinated, he wasn't overthrown, he simply stepped into the water, confident and unguarded, and the sea claimed him. Today, the beach where he disappeared bears a memorial, a plaque etched with his name. Ironically, one of the country's swimming pools was later named in his honor, the Harold Holt Memorial Pool, a strange, almost darkly humorous tribute to a man who loved the ocean too much. What happened to him remains one of the most enduring mysteries in modern Australian history. A prime minister swallowed by the surf, a nation left with questions that no tide could wash away. And while Holt vanished into the depths of the ocean, our next story begins thousands of feet in the air, with a modern mystery that remains the most haunting of our time. Because in 2014, a massive commercial airliner carrying 239 people lifted off into the night sky and never landed. This is the story of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Harold Holt disappeared beneath the waves, lost to the ocean's depths. Nearly half a century later, the sea would claim another mystery, this time one that spanned continents, nations and lives. Because when Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished from the skies, it didn't just take 239 passengers with it. It took with it the illusion that we had mastered flight. Even in the 21st century, it proved that some things can still vanish completely. It was March 8, 2014, a routine overnight flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. The aircraft was a Boeing 777-200ER, one of the safest and most reliable airliners in service. The crew were experienced, the weather was calm, and the flight plan was straightforward. At 12:41 a.m., Flight 370 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport. It was supposed to land in Beijing at 6:30 a.m. local time, but it never arrived. On board were 239 people, 227 passengers and 12 crew members from 14 different countries, among them families, students, engineers and children. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53, was a seasoned pilot with over 18,000 flying hours. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, just 27, was on his final training flight for certification. Nothing seemed unusual as the plane reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet over the South China Sea. At 1:19 a.m., Malaysian Air Traffic Control made final contact. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Those were the last words ever heard from the aircraft. Minutes later, it disappeared from radar. At first, no one panicked. Radar handovers between countries can cause brief signal losses. But when Beijing's air traffic control realized the plane hadn't checked in, and hours later hadn't landed, alarms spread. Search and rescue efforts were immediately launched over the South China Sea along the expected flight path. But there was nothing there, no wreckage, no signals, no emergency beacon, nothing. It was as if the aircraft had dissolved into the night. Then came the shocking discovery. Flight 370 hadn't vanished where everyone thought. Military radar from Malaysia revealed something astonishing. The plane had turned sharply west, flying back across the Malay Peninsula. It had then changed course again, heading northwest across the Andaman Sea, flying for nearly 7 more hours after losing contact. Someone had deliberately turned the plane around. The revelation changed everything. This was no simple mechanical failure. The transponder, but the device that communicates with air traffic control had been manually switched off, and the aircraft's communication system, known as ACARS, was also disabled. But the plane wasn't completely invisible. It was still communicating indirectly with satellites through automated handshakes, brief digital pings confirming its existence every hour. Those signals, later analyzed by the British company Inmarsat, traced the plane's final route into one of the most remote stretches of ocean on Earth, the southern Indian Ocean, west of Australia, an area so vast and empty that even in the satellite age, it remains a blank spot on our maps. In the weeks that followed, an international search began, one of the largest and most expensive in history. Dozens of ships, aircraft, and underwater drones combed the ocean floor for months. The area covered was 120,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Iceland. And yet, there was nothing. For 2 years, the sea kept its secret. Then, in July 2015, a breakthrough. A piece of aircraft debris, a flaperon from a Boeing 777, washed ashore on Reunion Island, off the coast of Africa, nearly 4,000 miles from the suspected crash zone. It was confirmed to be from Flight 370. More fragments followed: wing parts, cabin panels, pieces of interior insulation, scattered across the western Indian Ocean, carried by currents over thousands of miles. But still, no fuselage, no black box, no answers. Theories flooded the world, each more desperate than the last. The most accepted, though unproven, explanation is that the plane flew on autopilot for several hours after its systems were disabled, before running out of fuel and crashing into the ocean in a controlled or spiraling descent. But that still doesn't explain why. Was it an accident, a hijacking, a suicide, or something darker, something we still don't understand? One theory centers on the captain himself, Zahari Ahmad Shah. Investigators learned that he had flown a similar route on his home flight simulator, a path eerily close to the final satellite trajectory of MH370. Did he plan the disappearance? His family denied it. Friends described him as calm, professional, and kind. But the theory persists, that he may have been in control until the very end. Others point to a sudden catastrophic event, like a fire, depressurization, or electrical failure, that incapacitated the crew, leaving the plane to drift until it ran out of fuel. If true, it would explain the eerie silence and steady flight path. But again, why turn off communication systems first? And then there are the darker speculations: espionage, hijacking, or even accidental military shoot-downs. Some claim the plane was diverted intentionally, perhaps to Diego Garcia, a secretive U.S. naval base in the Indian Ocean. Others believe it was carrying sensitive cargo or passengers with knowledge that someone wanted to erase. None of these claims have ever been proven. But the lack of evidence keeps the fire of suspicion alive. For the families of those on board, the years that followed were agony. Vigils were held across Malaysia and China. Mothers held photos of their children at press conferences, begging for answers. Governments promised transparency, then quietly stepped back. Hope turned to frustration, and frustration to grief. In 2018, after 4 years of search efforts and nearly $200 million spent, the final mission, led by the U.S. company Ocean Infinity, was suspended. The sea floor was mapped in exquisite detail, thousands of sonar images captured, but the wreckage of Flight 370 was never found. Today it remains one of the greatest mysteries of modern aviation, a flight tracked across half the planet, gone without a trace, in an age when everything, from text messages to traffic lights, is recorded. Every few years a new theory emerges, a new sonar scan, a new promise that, this time, we'll find it. But the Indian Ocean keeps its silence. For many, Flight 370 isn't just about an airplane, it's about the illusion of certainty, the belief that technology can protect us from the unknown, that with enough data we can explain everything. But maybe the truth is simpler and harder. Maybe it lies in the one thing humans have never been able to control, the vast, indifferent ocean. To this day, the coordinates of Flight 370's final resting place are still unknown. All we have are fragments, both of metal and of memory, a wing washed up on a beach. A message left unread, a name still waiting to appear on a departure board that never changed to arrived. And as Flight 370 vanishes into the night, so does our next mystery, one that isn't about technology or the sea, but about the quiet violence of home, because sometimes disappearances don't happen in the air or water, but right where we should feel safest. This is the story of Mary Badaracco, 1984, a woman who vanished from her own driveway, leaving behind her car, her wedding rings, and 1,000 questions. The mystery of Flight 370 stretched across oceans, satellites, and nations. But our next disappearance happened in a small Connecticut town. No storms, no radar blips, no deep-sea secrets. Just a woman who was there one day and gone the next. Her name was Mary Badaracco, and her story is proof that sometimes the most haunting vanishings don't need distance or drama, just silence. It was August 1984 in Sherman, Connecticut, a quiet rural community where roads wound through forests and neighbors waved from their mailboxes. Mary was 38 years old. She was a mother of 2 grown daughters, independent, kind, and strong-willed. She worked as a housekeeper and was known for her warmth, the kind of woman who left every space cleaner, calmer, and somehow better than before. But her marriage was unraveling. She and her husband, Dominic Badaracco, had been separated for months. The relationship had grown volatile, arguments, financial strain, accusations. Friends later said Mary had been thinking about starting fresh, about filing for divorce. She wanted to move on. Then, one late summer afternoon, she disappeared. The last confirmed sighting of Mary was on August 20th, 1984. She had just returned home to the house she still shared with Dominic, though they were living separate lives under the same roof. Her daughters tried to call her that evening. No answer. By the next day, her car, a grey 1982 Chevrolet Cavalier, was still parked in the driveway. On the driver's seat were her wedding rings. Her purse and keys were gone. Mary herself was nowhere to be found. And Dominic? He told police that she had simply left him. According to Dominic's version, the two had argued that day. Mary told him she was done, that she wanted a divorce. He claimed she walked out, taking $100 in cash and disappearing into thin air. No friends saw her leave. No neighbors did either. No bus tickets, no luggage, no goodbyes. Just a car in the driveway, her rings on the seat, like punctuation at the end of a story that made no sense. At first, police didn't treat it as suspicious. Adults have the right to leave, they reasoned. But Mary's family knew something was wrong. Her daughters insisted their mother wouldn't have vanished willingly. Not without calling, not without a word. She was close to them. She'd been making plans. Weeks passed, then months. Still nothing, and soon whispers began to surface about Dominic Badaracco and about what kind of man he really was. Dominic was not a quiet, grieving husband. He was short-tempered, controlling, and connected, not just socially, but allegedly, criminally. He owned multiple businesses and had ties to figures involved in organized crime in Connecticut and New York. Police later discovered that Dominic sold Mary's car within weeks of her disappearance to one of his employees for cash. He also replaced parts of the driveway where her car had been parked, resurfacing it with new gravel. When investigators asked why, he said he just wanted it to look better. It didn't look better, it looked suspicious. But back in 1984, evidence was scarce. Without a body, without blood, without proof of foul play, the case went cold. Mary was officially listed as a missing person, though her family had long stopped believing she was just missing. Years turned into decades. Her daughters grew up, started families of their own, but they never stopped searching. They pushed police, wrote letters, begged for action. Their persistence kept Mary's case alive long after the world had moved on. In 1990, a small break came. An informant told police that Dominic had confessed to killing Mary, that he had buried her in the woods or had her body destroyed. But again, no evidence surfaced, no charges were filed. It wasn't until 2008, more than 20 years later, that the Connecticut State Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation. By then, Dominic was older, remarried, and still living in Connecticut, comfortable, confident, and unbothered. When police questioned him again, he refused to cooperate. His lawyer told them they'd never find a body. Then came the strangest twist of all. In 2010, a retired Connecticut state trooper named George Leniart claimed that Dominic had paid him off $100,000 to make the case go away. Leniart was already serving a life sentence for an unrelated murder, but his claims reopened old wounds and suspicions. The FBI got involved, search warrants were issued, property was dug up, dogs were brought in to search the grounds of the Badaraco home and surrounding areas of Sherman. But once again, no trace of Mary was ever found. Dominic was later arrested, not for murder, but for bribing a judge in connection to the case. He was convicted and served a short prison sentence. Even behind bars, he refused to talk. When reporters asked about Mary, he smiled and said, "No body, no crime," and that was it. The man who likely knew the truth outlived the investigation, dying in 2019, still never charged with his wife's disappearance. To this day, Mary Badaraco's body has never been found. Her daughters continue to fight for justice, her case still officially open under the Connecticut Cold Case Unit. Every few years a new tip comes in, a rumor, a field to search, a lead that fades as quickly as it appears, but the truth has stayed buried, just out of reach. Her car remains one of the strangest details, perfectly parked, keys gone, rings left behind, deliberately it seems. It's a gesture that feels both symbolic and final. As if she knew what was coming, or as if someone wanted it to look that way. Either way, the image endures. A grey car glinting under a late summer sun, wedding rings catching the light. A life quietly erased from the world. If you drive through Sherman today, you might miss the house entirely. It's just another property along a back road, quiet and unremarkable. But somewhere in those woods, or beneath that ground, the final chapter of Mary's story is still waiting to be found. Until then, her name sits on the long list of people who simply disappeared. Not into storms, not into jungles, not into legend, but into the everyday darkness of human secrets. Mary's case closes this collection of the world's most mysterious vanishings, from the skies above the Indian Ocean to the frozen corridors of history. Each story different, yet bound by the same unsettling truth that a person can be here one moment and gone the next. No witness, no answer, only questions that time refuses to bury. If you've made it this far into tonight's journey, thank you for listening. Tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is as you listen. And if you'd like to hear more stories like these, don't forget to subscribe and keep your curiosity alive, because sometimes the strangest truths are the ones we still can't explain.